Ephraim Rusk slammed his fist on the table so hard that the tin cups rattled off the edge and clattered across the dirt floor, and every single person in that meeting hall went dead silent. "Get her out," he said. Not shouted, said, which was somehow worse. That was the moment Maren Voss understood that truth, in Redstone Crossing, was only as powerful as the man willing to defend it. And no man in that room was willing. Not tonight. Not against Ephraim Rusk. If you were standing in her boots, right then 19 years old, no family left, every face in the room turned away from you. What would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this one move you, if you believe that the people the world writes off are sometimes the ones who end up writing history, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week, we bring you stories of ordinary people who refuse to stay buried. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, stay with me, because what happens next, inside Hollow Fang Canyon, will change everything you think you know about strength. The trouble started, as trouble so often does in small places, with a hungry child and a man too proud to be caught. Maren had been watching for 3 days before she said anything. That was her way. People in Redstone Crossing had grown so accustomed to underestimating her that they'd stopped paying attention to where she was or what she noticed. She was the big girl, the quiet one, the one whose mother had died 2 winters back and whose father had drunk himself into an early grave before that. She had no family name worth protecting, no alliance worth maintaining, and no man standing behind her with a rifle and a grievance. In a settlement like Redstone Crossing, that made her practically invisible, which was exactly why she saw what she saw. It was a boy named Pell, 7 years old, gap-toothed, with eyes too serious for his age, who first caught her attention. She'd seen him lingering near the community storehouse 3 evenings in a row, always after the other families had collected their weekly rations, always looking like a dog that expected to be kicked. On the 3rd evening, she followed at a distance and watched Calder Rusk, Ephraim's 22-year-old son, broad-shouldered and loud in the way that men are loud when they've never once been told, emerge from behind the storehouse with a half-empty grain sack and point directly at the boy. "You were here last night," Calder said. It wasn't a question. Pell shook his head. His bottom lip was trembling. "I saw you, little thief." "I didn't take nothing, sir, I swear." "Empty your pockets." The boy obeyed. There was nothing in them except a small smooth stone he'd been carrying like a talisman. Calder stared at it, then at the boy, and something shifted behind his eyes, not guilt exactly, more like calculation. He picked up the stone, turned it over in his fingers, then dropped it in the dirt. "I'll be watching you," he said, and walked away with the grain sack swinging at his side. Maren stood in the shadow of the adjacent woodshed, perfectly still. The boy bent down and picked up his stone. He didn't cry. That was the part that stayed with her. He was too accustomed to this to cry. She should have left it alone. Every reasonable instinct she had told her to leave it alone. She was already barely tolerated in Redstone Crossing since her mother died. She had no standing, no allies, no safety net. The Rusks owned the settlement's water rights, controlled the community grain stores, and sat on every committee that mattered. Ephraim Rusk had personally approved or denied the land claims of every family living within 15 miles of the settlement center. His word was not merely respected, it was load-bearing. Remove it, and things fell. She should have left it alone. She did not leave it alone. She spent the next 2 days asking quiet questions of people she trusted, which was a short list. Old Vera Hutchins, who had macular trouble but missed nothing that happened within earshot of her cabin. Tobin Hale, the blacksmith's apprentice, 2 years younger than Maren, and possessed of the specific kind of honesty that comes from being too guileless to bother with politics. A woman named Bess, who had grown up with Maren's mother and still felt some obligation toward the daughter. What she pieced together was this: for at least 4 months, small quantities of grain and dried goods had been going missing from the community stores. The discrepancies noticed twice in the ledger, and twice the explanation given by Calder, who helped manage the stores, was that the accounting had been wrong to begin with. Twice that explanation had been accepted, because Calder was Ephraim Rusk's son, and the ledger could be wrong, and what was the alternative? The alternative, Maren had come to believe, was that Calder was skimming, not massively, carefully, just enough to sell to passing traders for his own pocket, just infrequently enough that patterns were hard to establish. And when the boy Pell had wandered too close, too many evenings in a row, Calder had decided he was useful, a ready-made explanation already positioned to take blame, should blame ever become necessary. On the fourth day, Maren went to Ephraim Rusk. She did not go out of arrogance. She went because Pell's family had been told that their next ration allotment would be reduced, pending an investigation into suspected theft. She went because the boy was 7 years old and had never done anything wrong except be poor and visible. She went because there was nobody else going. She found Ephraim in his office at a generous word for a partitioned corner of the main community hall, separated from the rest of the room by a pair of pine boards and a curtain. He was a big man, going to gray at the temples, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome 20 years ago, and had since settled into something more like authority. He didn't ask her to sit down. She told him what she'd observed, methodically, without embellishment. She told him about the 3 evenings of watching, about the grains sack, about Calder's behavior with the boy. She told him about the ledger discrepancies she'd heard about from people who'd seen them. She kept her voice level and her hands still, because she absolutely knew that the moment she appeared emotional, she would stop being a witness and become a problem. Ephraim listened with his eyes on the middle distance, somewhere past her left shoulder. He did not interrupt. When she finished, there was a long pause during which she could hear men talking outside and a dog barking somewhere and the creak of the building adjusting to afternoon heat. Then he said, "Where did you say you heard about the ledger?" "I didn't say." "That's right, you didn't." He looked at her then, directly, for the first time since she'd started speaking. "My son manages those stores with considerable responsibility for a young man. He does the work of 3 people. The ledger discrepancies were accounting errors, as he explained at the time. I understand that's the explanation that was given. I'm telling you what I observed with. You're telling me," Ephraim said, and his voice went very quiet, "that my son is a thief. I'm telling you what I saw him do with a grain sack, and I'm asking you to look at the discrepancies again, for a child's family gets punished for something they didn't do." The silence after that was different. It had a texture to it. Ephraim stood up from behind his desk slowly, without hurry, and she realized, watching him unfold to his full height, that she had miscalculated something. She had walked in here, believing this was a problem of evidence and persuasion. She understood now that it was a problem of power, and she had none. "Think," he said, "that you are a young woman without family or standing who has decided, for reasons I cannot fathom, to make an accusation against my son based on watching him from behind a woodshed in the dark. I think this reflects poorly on your character and your judgment. I was in the woodshed at dusk. Not, I think," he continued, as though she hadn't spoken, "that the more interesting question is why the community stores seem to attract the attention of those without family connections to respectable households. I think that question deserves looking into." She heard the turn happening and felt it like a drop in temperature. "What does that mean?" "It means I'll be calling a community meeting tonight, and I expect every household to attend." She left his office and stood in the afternoon light outside and thought very carefully about whether there was anything she could do in those 4 hours to change what was about to happen. She thought about going to find Tobin or Bess or old Vera. She thought about whether any of them would stand up in a room full of people and say what they'd told her privately, knowing that Ephraim Rusk controlled their land claims, their water allocations, their grain rations, the approval of their building permits, and the favor of every trader who stopped at Redstone Crossing. She thought about all of that, and she went to the meeting anyway, because the alternative was letting a 7-year-old boy's family go hungry for something they didn't do, and she could not make herself do that. Community Hall filled up fast. Families she'd known her whole life, neighbors who had eaten at her mother's table, men she'd helped during the last harvest, women who had sat with her mother in the final weeks of her illness. They filed in and found their places, and she watched their eyes move toward her and then away with that particular avoidance that people practice when they are embarrassed and don't plan to do anything about it. Calder stood beside his father at the front of the room. He looked, Maren thought, exactly like a man who had already won and was just waiting for the ceremony to catch up. Ephraim spoke for about 10 minutes. He talked about the trust required to maintain a community. He talked about the hard work of keeping records in difficult conditions. He talked about his son's dedication. He talked, with heavy and meaningful pauses, about how certain disruptions to community harmony often came from those who, feeling themselves outside the bonds of established households and obligations, sought to cause division instead of contributing to shared prosperity. He never said Maren's name, he didn't have to. Then Calder spoke. He was smooth in a way his father wasn't, younger, quicker, with a smile that appeared and disappeared like weather. He said that he had noticed certain patterns of behavior that concerned him. He said that grain had gone missing in amounts too consistent to be an accounting error. He said that he had, with great reluctance, begun watching the area around the storehouse, and that he had observed, on multiple occasions, someone of substantial build moving near the stores after dark. He paused there, let it breathe, looked at the ceiling as though searching his conscience. Maren felt the room shift before he said another word. "I don't take pleasure in this," Calder said. "She's had a hard life, and I understand that. But we can't let sympathy substitute for accountability." The room was very quiet. Maren stood up. Her chair scraped back loud against the floorboards, and every head turned. Her heart was going like a hammer on an anvil, but her voice, when it came, was steadier than she felt. Everything he just described, the patterns, the watching, the observation near the storehouse, he's describing what I was doing because I was watching him. I saw him with a grain sack. I saw him threaten that boy. I've been trying to tell his father that for the last 6 hours, and instead of looking at the ledger they called this meeting, nobody moved. Does anyone else know about the ledger discrepancies? Because I heard about them from at least 3 people in this room. Still nothing. She looked at Bess. Bess studied the floor. She looked toward where old Vera sat in the corner, rheumy-eyed and very still. Vera looked back at her for a long moment, then looked away. She looked at Tobin Hale, standing near the back wall, with his arms crossed. Tobin was looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something complicated. Something that had both apology and fury in it, the face of a person fighting a battle inside themselves and losing. Ephraim stepped forward then. That was when he hit the table. That was when the tin cups fell. That was when the room went silent in the way that rooms go silent around power. "Get her out," he said. And then, in the careful language of a man who had clearly spent time deciding exactly how far he could go, he said that the settlement could not harbor individuals whose behavior endangered community trust, and that he was exercising, as settlement founder and elected administrator, the authority granted to him under their founding charter to ask Maren Voss to vacate settlement land within 24 hours. Someone near the back of the room said, "Where's she supposed to go?" Ephraim said, "That's her business." Someone else, a man, she never knew who, said, almost too quietly to hear, "She's a big girl. Maybe the wilderness will remind her of her place." There was laughter. Not from everyone. Not even from most people, but enough. Maren stood in the middle of it and did not cry. She was not going to cry in this room. She was going to stand on her own 2 feet in the middle of this room until every person present had looked at her or deliberately looked away. And then she was going to walk out of that door under her own power, and that was the only thing she could control right now, so that was the thing she was going to do. She walked out. Tobin caught up with her in the dark, 50 yards from the hall, breathing hard like he'd run to reach her. He pressed something into her hands, without speaking the axe from his forge, the good one, handle smooth from use, head newly sharpened, heavy and real and solid. "I should have stood up," he said. He couldn't meet her eyes. "Yes," she said. "You should have, Maren." "I know," she said. And she did know. She understood fear better than she wanted to. She just couldn't afford it right now. She closed her hands around the axe handle. "Is there water out at Hollow Fang Canyon?" He blinked. "What?" "The canyon they're going to send me to. Is there water?" He stared at her for a moment, with something new moving behind his eyes. "There's a stream inside the cave, I think." "That's what I heard." She nodded, already calculating. Already, somewhere in the back of her mind, past the grief and the humiliation and the cold fury that was going to take a long time to fully process, already thinking about water and shelter and what one woman with one axe and one stubborn mule could actually build. "Thank you for the axe," she said. She went back and packed what she had. It didn't take long. The next morning, with bramble loaded and the axe across her shoulder and the whole settlement watching from doorways without meeting her eyes, Maren Voss walked out of Redstone Crossing and toward Hollow Fang Canyon. She was 19 years old. She had 30 pounds of provisions, a mule, a borrowed axe, and a decision forming somewhere in her chest that was harder and more durable than anything Ephraim Trusks had ever built. She would survive long enough to make every single one of them wrong. That was the only plan she needed for now. The canyon did not welcome her. That was the first thing Maren understood. As the Bramble picked his way down the switchback trail in the gray early light of that first morning, Hollow Fang Canyon was not a place that had any interest in whether she lived or died. The walls rose on both sides, dark and indifferent, streaked with old watermarks, and the pale ghost shapes of lichen that had been growing there since long before Redstone Crossing existed and would go on growing long after everyone in it was forgotten. The trail was narrow and loose with shale, and twice Bramble stumbled, and she had to grab his halter and talk him steady, and both times she felt the weight of everything loaded on his back shift and threaten and settle again. She thought about what it would mean if he went down, if she lost the provisions or the axe, or broke something that couldn't be fixed out here, and she pushed that thought aside because there was no use carrying it yet. The cave entrance was larger than she'd expected. She'd heard it describe people in Redstone Crossing, used Hollow Fang like a threat, the way adults use dark places to frighten children into obedience, and the descriptions had always made it sound cramped and miserable. It was neither. The opening was maybe 15 feet across and 12 feet high, a ragged arch in the cliff face with a lip of rock overhead that jutted out enough to shed rain. The floor inside was mostly flat. The walls were damp but not dripping, and about 40 feet in, she could hear it water, moving somewhere in the dark, a low and steady sound like a voice, speaking just below the range of understanding. Tobin had been right. There was water inside. She stood at the entrance for a long moment with Bramble's lead rope in her hand and looked at what she had. 1 mule, 1 axe, 30 pounds of provisions that would last, if she was careful, maybe 6 weeks. Clothes on her back. The knowledge in her head, which was considerable and which no one from Redstone Crossing had thought to take from her. 6 weeks to figure out how to stay alive indefinitely. She tied Bramble to a pine root near the canyon floor, where there was some scrubby grass, pulled out the axe, and went to look at the trees. The first week was about survival in the most immediate and unglamorous sense. She was not, and she knew this about herself, naturally gifted at suffering in silence. Her mother had always said she felt things loud, even when she didn't say them out loud, and that first week she felt things extremely loud, the soreness that began in her shoulders on day 2 and spread through her entire back by day 4, the blisters that opened on her palms and then reopened every morning when she picked up the axe again, the particular misery of being cold and damp and alone, and knowing that the people who had put her here were sleeping in actual beds inside actual walls. She cataloged the unfairness of it with great thoroughness in the privacy of her own head, and then she went back to work, because cataloging it didn't change it. She identified the water source on day 2, a spring that welled up from a crack in the cave floor about 50 feet in, cold and clear and smelling of minerals. She tasted it carefully, waited to see if it made her sick, decided on day 3 that it was safe. That was the first real relief she'd felt. Water was the margin between possible and impossible, and now she had it. Food was the second problem. She'd brought enough to survive the immediate term, but she needed to understand what was available in the canyon before her provisions ran out. She spent the afternoons of that first week walking the canyon floor and the lower slopes, learning what was there. Pine nuts from the scrubby pines in the upper canyon, wild onion growing in clusters near the spring's runoff, a stand of cattail further down where the canyon widened, and a shallow pool collected after rain. Most of its windows were dark, rabbit sign everywhere, droppings and tracks, and the pressed grass circles where they'd been sitting. She had no traps and no snares, but she knew how to make them from what her father had taught her in the years before drinking. Swallowed him whole, and she spent the evenings of that first week constructing them from bent green wood and cordage she pulled from her pack. On day 5, she caught for rabbit. She sat with it for a moment before cleaning it, not from sentimentality, but from something she couldn't quite name. Acknowledgement, maybe. She was still here. The canyon had not taken her yet. Bramble watched her with his dark, skeptical eyes, and she scratched behind his ears and told him he was the best mule in the territory, which was probably a low bar given the circumstances. But she meant it anyway. The decision to build came on day 8. She'd been thinking about it since day 2, the way you think about something that frightens you, circling it, testing it from different angles, looking for the reason it won't work. Cave was shelter in the sense that it kept rain off and blocked wind, but it was cold in the deep way that stone is cold. A cold that came up through the floor and settled into joints and kept sleep shallow and thin. She needed fire, and fire inside a cave without ventilation was more danger than warmth. She needed walls that held heat. She needed a door she could close. She needed a cabin. The idea of it, one woman, one axe, no tools, no help, should have been laughable. She was aware of that. She was also aware that nobody was going to find it funny except her, because there was no one else in the canyon, and she had run out of patience for other people's opinions about what she could or couldn't do. She walked the tree line for 2 days, selecting and marking. Not the biggest trees, she couldn't move the biggest trees. Not the smallest, they wouldn't give her logs worth laying. She was looking for the middle ones, the ones she could fell and limb and drag with Bramble's help, the ones that were straight enough to stack, the ones close enough to the cave entrance that the hauling wouldn't destroy her before the building could begin. She marked 17 trees on the first day and went back and unmarked 4 of them on the second day after she'd slept on it. The first tree she felled took her most of a morning. It wasn't that she didn't know how. She'd watched men do it at Redstone Crossing during the settlement's early building years, when she was young enough to be underfoot and old enough to remember what she observed. She knew about the notch cut, about working with gravity and lean, about getting clear when the creak turned into a groan. The knowledge was there. What wasn't there was the strength. Not that she lacked strength. She was strong, had always been strong in the way that big women often are, in ways nobody credits. She had swung an axe for hours at a stretch before, and the muscles required were specific, and they screamed at her all afternoon. The tree came down into the canyon at an angle she hadn't quite intended and took out a young pine on its way that she hadn't wanted it to lose. She stood there in the ringing silence after the crash and breathed and let her arms hang at her sides like dead weight. "That's one," she said out loud to nobody. She limbed it lying on the ground, which was slower and harder than she'd expected because the branches were tough and the angles were awkward. And 3 times the axe glanced off something, and she came very close to putting it into her own leg. She was more careful after the 3rd time. Slower. More careful cost her daylight, but it was better than the alternative. That night, she ate rabbit and pine nuts and lay on her bedroll in the cave entrance and looked at the stars through the gap in the canyon walls and thought about Redstone Crossing. She thought about Pell, the boy, and whether his family was still being punished for what Calder had done. She thought about Bess staring at the floor and Vera looking away and Tobin's face with all that apology in it that hadn't managed to become action. She thought about Calder's careful smile and Ephraim's quiet voice and the sound of the tin cups hitting the floor. She was not going to lie to herself and say she felt at peace. She was furious. The fury was like a coal in her chest, not hot anymore, not the blazing thing it had been in the meeting hall, but banked down to something dense and red that she suspected was going to burn for a very long time. She was going to have to figure out what to do with that fury, because she couldn't afford to spend her energy on it. But she also didn't think she could put it out. She decided to use it. Every morning she got up before first light, and she worked until she couldn't anymore. And on the mornings, when the soreness was bad enough that she wanted to stay on the bedroll, she thought about Calder's smile, and she got up. By the end of the 2nd week, she had felled 6 trees, limbed them, and begun the work of dragging them to the cave entrance with Bramble's help. Bramble was, it turned out, extremely strong for his size, and had very definite opinions about how the work should go. He would haul when she asked him to, and he would stop when he thought the footing was bad, and he would not be moved from that position regardless of what she said to him. Twice she lost her temper at him and said things that were not kind, and both times he looked at her with his long face and slow blink and waited until she was done. She always apologized. She meant it. The first 2 logs she positioned were crooked because the ground was not as level as she'd believed from looking at it, and she didn't realize until she'd already chinked the notches, and laid the second course that the foundation was going to pull the wall out of plumb as she went higher. She stared at it for a long time. Then she took the second log off, dug out and leveled the ground under the first one, repositioned it, and started again. That cost her 2 days. She said things during those 2 days that she would not want repeated. The work had a rhythm to it eventually, the way any long physical effort finds a rhythm if you do it long enough without quitting. Wake before light. Feed Bramble from the grain she rationed carefully. Check the snares, reset any that had sprung empty. Bring in the morning's catch if there was one. Work the logs until midday. Rest, eat, drink from the spring, work the logs until the light failed. Sleep. Begin again. Her hands stopped blistering and started callousing. The ache in her shoulders became a specific, manageable thing, rather than a general misery. She began to read the logs the way a carpenter reads wood. This one wants to split here. This one has a twist in it. This one is good, and she needs to use it where the load will bear hardest. Nobody came from Redstone Crossing. She hadn't expected them to. That didn't make the absence smaller. On the 18th day, she had 4 walls standing to chest height and had begun to think seriously about the roof, which was the part of the problem she'd been putting off because she didn't have a clean solution for it yet. Most of it, she needed ridge poles she couldn't haul alone, and she needed something to lay across them that would shed water. And she was working through the options available to her in this specific canyon, with these specific materials, when she noticed that Bramble kept avoiding a section of the inner cave wall near the far edge of the spring. She'd chalked it up to mule stubbornness, which was a category large enough to explain most things Bramble did. But on the 18th evening, tired and sitting with her back against the cool cave wall, eating the last of her dried corn, she watched him do it again, come within 10 feet of that section, stop, flick his ears back up, go around. Mules did not avoid things without reason. She'd learned that from her father in the narrow window before he became someone who couldn't teach her anything anymore. Mules had been bred for too many generations around mines and dangerous terrain to spook without cause. If Bramble was going around a particular piece of wall, there was something about that piece of wall worth paying attention to. She went over with the torch she'd made from pine pitch and a green stick, crude but functional, and held it up close. The wall was dark stone at eye level, the kind of dense compressed rock that made up most of the canyon's interior geology. But here, in this section that Bramble kept avoiding, the stone had a different character to it, warmer to the touch, slightly different in color, darker at the edges and in the cracks, but with a section near the middle that was lighter, almost cream-colored, embedded in the dark matrix around it. She pressed her palm against it, definitely warmer than the surrounding stone. Not dramatically but noticeably, the way a wall holds heat that's been on the south side of a building all afternoon. She was tired and she had roof problems to solve, and she told herself she'd look at it properly tomorrow. She looked at it properly tomorrow. She pulled the small pick she'd packed more tool than weapon, barely 4 pounds, but the sharpest point she had, and chipped at the edge of the light snit. The outer layer of dark rock crumbled away easier than she'd expected, like it was a crust rather than solid formation. And underneath it, the stone was different again, denser, almost glassy, white quartz. She knew what quartz looked like. The canyon had plenty of it in the upper walls, gray-white and plain, pretty enough in the right light, but common as pine needles. This was different. The color was brighter, almost pure, and running through it in veins that she had to lean close and tilt the torch to see clearly. Gold, not a flake. Not the suggestive glimmer that hopeful people read into every shiny mineral in every creek bed from here to the coast. Actual gold, in actual veins, running through the white quartz in threads that caught the torchlight and held it like they were arguing with the dark. Maren stood there for a long time without moving. The fire popped. Bramble shifted his weight somewhere behind her. The spring made its steady underground sound. She reached out and touched one of the veins with her fingertip. Cold. It did not feel like what it was. It felt like rock with an unusual color. The fact that it was the thing that men killed each other over and crossed deserts and ruined themselves and their families to find that fact was information her brain had processed, but her emotions hadn't caught up to yet. She picked a little more. The vein was consistent, not a surface fluke. It went deeper. She could see that, from the angle of it, the way it ran through the quartz and disappeared into solid wall, and presumably continued beyond what she could see. She could not tell how large the deposit was. She did not have the knowledge to make that determination. But she understood enough geology from her father's scattered talk, from the men she then listened to at Redstone Crossing over the years, from the general knowledge that accumulates in frontier settlements where mining is always somewhere in the conversation. She understood enough to know that what she was looking at was not small. She sat down on the cave floor with her back against the opposite wall and looked at it. She thought about Ephraim Rusk saying, "Get her out." She thought about being told the wilderness would remind her of her place. She thought about the tin cups hitting the floor and the room full of people who could not look at her. Here was the thing she sat with for a long time in the torchlight. The gold did not change anything that mattered right now. She still needed a roof. She still needed to get through the rest of the winter. She still needed to keep Bramble fed, and her snares working, and her water supply uncontaminated, and her body functioning well enough to do the work. The gold was an extraordinary fact that she would have to think carefully about, that she would need help to properly understand and legally secure, that could reshape everything about her future. But her future required a present, and her present required a roof. And she was not going to let an astonishing discovery become an excuse to stop doing the work in front of her. She covered the exposed quartz with loose stone from the cave floor. Not from strategy, she hadn't thought that far yet, but from instinct, the same instinct that had kept her quiet for 3 days at Redstone Crossing before she said anything about Calder. She was a person who did not speak before she understood what she was going to say. She would understand this. Then she would decide what to say. Most of its windows were dark. The roof problem resolved itself in stages, the way hard problems sometimes do when you've been at them long enough that your brain keeps working on them even when you're doing something else. The ridge poles were the central difficulty. She needed them long and straight and heavy enough to span the 12 feet between her front and back walls. And she needed to get them up there without pulleys or rigging or a second pair of hands. She lay awake on her bedroll one night, turning the problem over and over, and somewhere between the second and third hour, she thought about the cave entrance itself, the way the rock lip jutted out over the opening, the natural shelf of stone it created. She didn't need to span the whole width with a single beam. She could run her ridge from the cave wall to the cabin's front post, using the cave's own structure as the back half of her roof support. Cave was already a roof. She only needed to close the front. It was obvious once she saw it. The most useful solutions usually are. She spent the next 3 days reconfiguring her back wall entirely, shortening the cabin footprint by 4 feet and tying the structure into the cave's natural formation. It cost her work she'd already done, and she was curt with herself about it, not catastrophizing, just noting the loss and moving forward. And by the 4th day, she had the ridge pole in place and had begun laying split wood across it to form the roof deck. The walls went up the rest of the way over the following week. She had to improvise the chinking the mix of clay and dry grass. She packed into the gaps between logs was imperfect, and she knew it would need revisiting, but it held out most of the draft, and that was enough for now. She had no window, and she didn't try to make one. She had the cave entrance for light during the day. The door was her final problem. She had the frame, but she needed something to hang in it that would actually block cold and wind. She used hides. It took her 4 more rabbits and 2 careful days of stretching and working the skins, and the result was a hanging that would not have impressed anyone accustomed to proper doors. But it covered the opening and broke the wind, and when she stood inside on the far side of it and put her hand up near the frame, she could feel that the interior was noticeably, genuinely warmer than the outside air. She had built a house. She stood in the middle of it, dirt floor, 1 room, smoke stained from the fire pit she'd dug in the corner, no furniture except her bedroll and the provision crates stacked along one wall, and she felt something shift in her chest that was not quite pride and not quite relief, but some combination of both things with something else underneath them that she didn't have a clean word for. She had been sent here to disappear, to become a cautionary story that Ephraim Rusk would tell, sometimes quietly, to people who needed reminding of what happened when you forgot your place. The girl who got above herself. The big girl who thought she knew better. The wilderness swallowed her up. What a shame. What a lesson. She had been here 34 days. She had a water supply, a food system, a house, and more gold in the cave wall than Ephraim Rusks had seen in his entire life. She sat down on a provision crate, put her face in her hands, and cried for about 5 minutes. Not from sadness, not entirely. It was the kind of crying that happens when a thing you've been holding up for a very long time is set down for a moment and the body takes the opportunity to release some of what that holding cost. Most of its windows were dark. Then she washed her face with spring water, ate the last of her dried corn, which meant she was now entirely dependent on what the canyon could provide, which she had known was coming, and went to sleep. She woke in the night to Bramble, making a sound she'd never heard him make before. Not a brace, something lower, more urgent, a deep-chested rumble that she associated with horses near something that frightened them. She grabbed the axe from beside the bedroll and pushed through the high door in the dark, and the cold hit her like a flat hand. She stood outside and listened. Silence. Canyon silence, which had its own texture, the distant drip of water, wind working somewhere high in the rock walls, the tiny sounds of small creatures going about their small lives in the dark. Nothing that explained Bramble's alarm. She was about to go back inside when she heard it. A sound from up the canyon trail. Not an animal. Too deliberate, too irregular, something that stopped and started, that had the rhythm of something exhausted rather than something hunting. She gripped the axe and stood in the dark entrance of her cabin and waited. What came down the trail out of the darkness was not what she'd expected. She'd been preparing herself, she realized, for men for Rusk's people, for someone from Redstone Crossing come to confirm she was dead, or to ensure she became so. She'd been tensing for confrontation. Instead, there was a man, a woman, and a small shape bundled against the woman's chest, and the man was moving wrong, limping badly. One hand on the canyon wall for balance, and the woman was making a sound that Maren recognized a moment before she could name it. The quiet, barely controlled sound of someone who has been terrified for a long time, and is too tired to hide it anymore. "Please," the man said. He'd spotted her in the dark. "There's a fire. I saw a fire." Maren looked at them for a moment. The small shape against the woman's chest coughed a wet, rattling, deep chest. Coughed. That sounded entirely wrong for anything that small, and that was the only thing that needed to happen. She stepped back and held the door open. "Get inside," she said. "Both of you." The man's name was Gideon Fenwick. The woman was Laurel. And the small thing against Laurel's chest, bundled in 2 coats and still shaking, was their daughter, Nell, who was 6 years old and burning with a fever that had been climbing for 2 days. Gideon had broken the front axle of their wagon 4 miles up the canyon trail, in the dark, in the early edge of a storm that was coming down from the north with the kind of speed and intent that left no room for error. They'd left the wagon, couldn't move it, couldn't fix it in the dark, without tools, and walked. He'd sprained or broken something in his left ankle on the way down. He was pale under the trail dirt and clearly running on pure stubbornness. Laurel had not said a word since coming inside. She sat with Nell in her lap and the girl against her shoulder, and she watched Maren with the specific expression of a person who has run out of choices and is waiting to see what the shape of their remaining luck looks like. Maren looked at what she had. 1 small room, her bedroll. The provisions she was already rationing carefully. A fire that was going to need more fuel than she had stockpiled for 1 person through what was going to be a serious storm. A child who needed warmth and fluids, and probably medicine she didn't have. She looked at all of that, and she went to put more wood on the fire. Tell me exactly what her fever's been doing," she said to Laurel, not looking up from the fire. "When it started, how high it's gone, whether she's been able to keep water down." Laurel blinked. Something in her face broke loose a little, the way frozen ground shifts in the first thaw. 2 days. She felt warm on the trail, and then by the second morning she wouldn't wake up easy. She drinks water, but not much. She coughed through both nights. Any rash? Her skin showing anything unusual? No, just the fever and the cough. Maren nodded. She knew enough from her mother, from the general frontier knowledge, that women accumulated out of necessity to make a considered assessment. Lung fever, most likely. The wet cough, the climbing temperature, the lethargy. She didn't have willow bark, she'd used the last of it weeks ago, but she had dried yarrow, and she had wild onion, and she had the spring water that was cold and clean, and she had the knowledge to make a tea that could bring a fever down far enough to stop it from doing damage. She was already building the fire higher and getting water from the spring when the storm hit in earnest. The sound of it against the canyon walls was extraordinary. She had not been in Assyria since she'd been in the canyon, and she had not understood until now how the geography amplified things, how the narrow walls focused wind into a concentrated howl and sent it down the canyon like something with a purpose. The hide door bucked, and she'd weighted it with a log along the bottom edge before the Fenwicks arrived, and now she was grateful for that instinct. She worked through the night. She made the fever tea and got Nell to drink it in small sips, holding the cup herself, because the girl was too weak to manage it, talking in the low, steady voice she'd used with Bramble in the first days when he was uncertain about the canyon and needed something reliable to orient toward. Nell's eyes tracked her sometimes, and sometimes they didn't. Her breathing was labored in a way that made Maren's chest tight, but it was not the rattling, desperate breathing of something failing. It was the heavy, working breathing of a body fighting. Bodies fought. She had to trust that. Gideon had fallen asleep sitting against the wall within 30 minutes of coming inside, which told her how far past his limits he'd been pushed. His ankle had swollen badly inside his boot, and she'd worked it off carefully without waking him and packed it in cold-soaked cloth and propped it up and left him. He'd deal with it in the morning. Right now he needed sleep more than he needed to know how bad it was. Laurel did not sleep. She watched Maren work and held Nell's hand when Maren set the girl down on the bedroll, and sometime around what Maren estimated was the second or third hour of the night, she said quietly, "Where did you come from?" "I didn't know anyone was out here. I didn't know anyone was coming," Maren said, which was not an answer, but it was what she had. "Are you a trapper?" "No." She was rewetting the cloth she'd been using on Nell's forehead. "I live here." Laurel was quiet for a moment. "Alone? Me and my mule." "That's—" Laurel started and stopped. "I know," Maren said. She didn't sleep at all. Kept the fire going through the whole storm, which meant burning wood faster than she was comfortable with, which meant she was going to have serious work ahead of her once the storm cleared and the Fenwicks were stable enough to leave or help. She tracked Nell's fever through the night by touch, feeling for the small forehead every hour or so, logging the information in the back of her mind the way she logged everything methodically, without panic, keeping the fear at a level where it was useful rather than overwhelming. Around what she thought must be the hour before dawn, she felt Nell's forehead, and it was different. Still warm, but differently warm. The aggressive, consuming heat had stepped back. The girl's breathing had shifted too, deeper and slower and less labored. Her color in the firelight was less frightening. Maren sat back on her heels and breathed. Behind her, in the rock wall, under the loose stones she'd piled over it, gold-weighted in its white quartz matrix, patient as geology, indifferent to the night's drama. She had not thought about it once in the last 8 hours. That told her something she filed away carefully, that whatever the gold eventually meant for her life, it did not, at the fundamental level, change what she was. She had opened her door in the dark to strangers because a child was sick, and a door that opened was the difference between alive and not. She had burned her winter wood supply faster than she'd planned, because warmth was what was needed and she had it to give. She had not slept, because sleep was something she could sacrifice, and Nell's fever was something Nell could not. The gold was in the wall. It had always been in the wall. What it was going to do in the world depended entirely on what Maren chose to do with it, and those were decisions she would make carefully. And later, when the storm had passed, and a little girl was safely breathing, and her parents had eaten something, and the immediate business of being alive had been attended to, she put another log on the fire. Outside, the storm pressed on against the canyon walls, and inside the small, unlikely cabin at the mouth of Hollow Fang Cave, the fire held. The storm broke sometime mid-morning, and Maren knew it not from any window. She still had none but from the change in sound. The howling compression of wind against canyon walls eased into something more ordinary, and the hide door stopped its constant straining against the weight log, and the fire, which had been fighting the cold draft that crept in at every gap and crack, settled into a steadier burn. She had been awake for something close to 30 hours. She did not feel it yet in any clean or definitive way. That came later. She knew the exhaustion that waited politely until the emergency passed, and then sat down on you, like a stone. Right now she was still running on the particular alertness that danger produces, the kind that keeps the edges sharp, past all reasonable expectation, and then collects its debt without warning. Nell was sleeping. Her breathing had smoothed out overnight into something that no longer sounded like work. And when Maren touched her forehead at first light, the heat had retreated to something manageable, still present, still concerning, but no longer the raging thing it had been. The color in her cheeks was human again, rather than the hectic, frightening flush of the night before. Her small hands, folded near her chin on the bedroll, had stopped their restless clenching and unclenching. Gideon woke around the same time the storm broke. He came up from sleep disoriented and grabbed for something that wasn't there, and then his eyes found Laurel, and then Nell, and then Maren sitting across the fire from all of them, and the sequence of understanding moved across his face in slow, distinct stages where he was, what had happened, what he did not yet know. He tried to stand and made a sound that was not a word. "Don't," Maren said. "Your ankle." He looked down at his propped and wrapped foot as though seeing it for the first times, which was essentially true. How bad, I don't know. Could be a bad sprain, could be a small break. Either way, you're not walking on it today. He absorbed this with the particular expression of a man who has never been good at sitting still and has just been told he has no choice. His eyes went to Nell. She's better? Better than she was. Not well. She needs to stay warm and keep taking the tea. She needs to eat if she's willing, and she needs to be watched for the next day at least. Maren paused. She came through the worst of it in the night. I think she'll be all right. The sound Gideon made then was not a word either, but it was a different kind of not word. He put his face in his hands for a moment, and Laurel reached across and put her hand on his arm, and Maren looked at the fire and gave them that moment without comment. When he looked up again, his eyes were red at the edges. I don't even know your name. Maren Voss. He introduced himself and Laurel properly, with the slightly formal courtesy of people who've been raised to observe civility even in the most uncivil circumstances. Gideon Fenwick, carpenter by trade, traveling with his family to his wife's sister's settlement 3 days east. The wagon had been poorly loaded. Hal, he said it with the flat honesty of someone assigning fault correctly. The front axle had been carrying more weight than it was designed for, on rough trail, and when the front left wheel had dropped into a hole he hadn't seen in the failing light, the axle had simply given up. I had to choose, he said. Leave everything, or leave the wagon. You chose right. He looked at Nell. I almost didn't stop. I thought the fire might be, I don't know what I thought. Someone dangerous. You had a sick child, Maren said. Dangerous stops being the most important consideration. Laurel, who had been watching this exchange quietly, said, How long have you been out here? In the canyon. About 5 weeks. Alone? Mere mule, Laurel said, and something shifted in her expression. Not pity, something more complicated than pity, more alert. You built this yourself. It wasn't a question. She'd been in the room long enough to understand what she was looking at. Maren didn't answer it as though it required one. I'll check on him and get more wood. The storm will have put some trees down, and I need to look at the trail before you try to take your daughter up it. She pushed through the hide door into cold, bright, post-storm air that tasted like stone and pine and the particular mineral sharpness of fresh snow which had fallen on the upper canyon walls and the higher ground above but had come down here, mostly as sleet, coating every surface in a thin crackling shell that caught the morning light and threw it in small prismatic sparks. Bramble was in his corner of the cave, alive and annoyed and hungry, and she fed him and checked his feet and his coat and told him he'd done very well, which was mostly true. He'd stayed put through the entire storm without working himself loose, which she counted as a considerable achievement for a mule with opinions. She spent an hour assessing the trail and the immediate area. 2 trees were down in the lower canyon, but not across the trail itself. The switchback up to the canyon rim was icy in patches, but passable on foot with care. The wagon Gideon had described was a different problem 4 miles up the canyon trail with a broken axle, and whatever they'd left loaded on it, and she didn't have the tools or the materials to fix an axle, even if she could get to it. That problem was going to require time she didn't have a clear plan for yet. Came back inside and told them what she'd found, and they talked through it practically the way people talk when the situation is serious enough that there's no room for anything other than clear thinking. Gideon could not travel for at least 2 or 3 days. Nell should not travel for at least that long, possibly longer. Their provisions were on the wagon. What Maren had in her cabin was what they had to work with, and she laid it out plainly, enough for one person for roughly 3 weeks, which among 3 adults and a child, rationed carefully, would stretch to perhaps 8 or 9 days. There's game in the canyon, she said, and the spring hasn't frozen. We're not in danger of dying in the next week, but we need to be systematic. Gideon looked at her steadily. You're feeding us out of your own stores. You can't exactly replace them from the wagon right now. When you can travel, we'll figure out the wagon, she said. Right now, the only thing that matters is getting your daughter through the next 72 hours. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then, what do you need me to do? She put him to work doing the things he could do. Sitting down, tightening the door frame, which she'd noted was pulling slightly off plumb on the right side, checking the chinking along the lower wall courses where the storm had loosened some of her packed clay. He had a carpenter's hands and a carpenter's eye, and within an hour, he'd found 3 things she hadn't noticed and fixed them with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd spent years looking at structures and knowing what they were saying. Laurel managed Nell, keeping her warm and getting the fever tea into her at regular intervals, and proved to be considerably more capable than her shattered state of arrival had suggested. By midday, she'd reorganized Maren's provision stores in a way that was more efficient than what Maren had been doing, and she'd found a way to use the provision crates as a proper raised sleeping surface for Nell that got the girl off the cold ground and let the fire's warmth reach her better. Maren noticed both of these things without commenting on them. The Fenwicks, she was beginning to understand, were not people who needed managing. Most of its windows were dark. They were people who needed the immediate crisis to pass enough that they could start functioning again. She went out in the afternoon to run the longer snare line she'd established in the upper canyon. Cold had made the trails harder but cleaner, and she came back with 2 rabbits and a large grouse that had apparently been sitting stupefied by the storm in the lower branches of a pine and had made the decision of her morning much easier. She cleaned them outside, quickly and without ceremony, and brought them in and had them in the fire pot before Nell woke from her afternoon sleep. When Nell woke, she was lucid for the first time since arriving. She looked at the ceiling of the cabin, then at Laurel, then at Maren, and said in a voice like dry leaves, "Where's this?" "Cabin," Laurel said. "We're safe." Nell looked at Maren with the direct, uncomplicated assessment that small children apply to strangers. "Is this your cabin? You live here?" "Yes." "All by yourself?" "Me and my mule." Nell considered this information with apparent seriousness. "What's your mule's name?" "Bramble." "That's a funny name for a mule." "He's a funny mule," Maren said. Nell seemed satisfied by this. She drank the tea Laurel offered without complaint, ate a small amount of the broth, Maren ladled out, and fell asleep again within the hour. But she had been conscious and coherent, and asked questions and expressed opinions, and that more than any change in temperature or breathing was the moment Maren allowed herself to believe the girl was going to make it. Gideon ate his broth that evening in the way that very hungry, very relieved people eat, with the total focused attention of someone for whom food has returned to being one of the most important things in the world after a period of being irrelevant to survival. When he finished, he set the cup down and looked at the fire for a while without speaking. "I'm a carpenter," he said eventually. "I said that already. But I mean, I'm good at it. I build things that stand up. I built a church in my last settlement that's still standing 11 years later." He paused. "I'm going to find a way to square this debt. You don't owe me anything." "I know you think that," he said. "I don't." The next 2 days had the peculiar texture of enforced stillness layered over ongoing crisis, the kind of time that moves slowly while it's happening and compresses to almost nothing in memory afterward. Nell improved in increments that were sometimes obvious and sometimes frustratingly invisible. Her fever came down, and then climbed a little, and then came down further, the 2 steps forward, 1 step back pattern of recovery that Maren recognized from watching her mother nurse sick neighbors over the years. Cough persisted but changed character, loosening, becoming more productive, which was a sign the body was clearing rather than drowning. Maren slept in 4-hour intervals, which was all she could justify. She maintained the snares, kept the fire going, monitored the water supply, and kept a running accounting in the back of her mind of what they were consuming against what remained. Gideon could not walk, but his hands worked fine, and he repaid his board and labor. By the end of the second day, her door had a proper frame. 3 of her wall gaps had been rechinked with greater expertise than she'd managed, and he'd looked at her roof and declared it functional, but said he could improve it significantly if she could get him the materials, which she filed as information for later. Laurel talked more as Nell improved, the way people do when the worst fear recedes and there's room again for ordinary human exchange. She asked Maren questions, not prying ones, but the genuine curiosity of someone trying to understand something she found remarkable. How long had she been building? Where had she learned? What was Maren's plan? Was she staying? Maren answered the technical questions readily. The personal ones she answered carefully. You were sent here, Laurel said on the second evening. It wasn't a question. She'd picked up enough from the sparse things Maren had said to understand the basic shape of the situation. I was told to leave the settlement. For what? Maren told her, briefly and without embellishment. The theft, the boy, the meeting, Ephraim Rusk's fist on the table. She didn't perform it, just laid it out flat, the way she'd told Ephraim himself, and watched Laurel's face go through the same sequence of expressions that honest people's faces go through. Here's something in this that is both shocking and, upon reflection, entirely believable. And what are you going to do? Laurel asked. About the man who did this to you? Nothing, Maren said. Not yet. Not until I understand what I have here. Laurel looked around at the cabin, the rough walls, the dirt floor, the fire, the cave opening behind them with its steady sound of underground water. Her eyes stopped somewhere near the back wall, where Maren had piled the loose stones over the exposed quartz. She didn't ask about it. Either she hadn't focused on it specifically, or she had the discretion not to ask about things that hadn't been offered. Maren found she respected that. On the morning of the third day, Nell sat up by herself, asked for water, then asked if she could see the mule. They bundled her carefully and brought her to the cave entrance, and Bramble, who had demonstrated throughout the Fenwick's stay a studied indifference to their presence, walked over to Nell without and sniffed being led and sniffed at her hair with apparent thoroughness. Nell laughed a real laugh, unexpected and clear, and Maren felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized was clenched. He smells funny, Nell announced. He thinks the same about you, probably, Maren said. That afternoon, Gideon stood up carefully and tested his ankle with weight. He went pale, and then steadied and declared that he thought it was a sprain rather than a break, which Maren had suspected but couldn't confirm. He could walk badly with a stick. Not 4 miles of canyon trail yet, but progress. They talked practically about the wagon. Gideon needed his tools, a carpenter. Without his tools was significantly reduced, and there were provisions and personal items his family needed from it. The most direct solution was for Maren to take Bramble up the trail and retrieve what could be loaded onto a mule, leaving the wagon frame for when Gideon could manage the trip himself or arrange for proper recovery. She went the next morning. Trail was 4 miles of increasingly rough ground, and she found the wagon where he describes listing to the left with the broken axle dropped, and the front wheel at an angle that said clearly it was not going anywhere under its own power. She loaded Bramble methodically, tools first, then the provision sacks, then the personal bundle that Laurel had described, then the 2 small things Nell had apparently insisted on packing for the journey, carved wooden figure and a striped blanket that had belonged to her grandmother. She stood for a moment at the wagon before heading back, looking at the canyon above her. The walls up here were different, higher, more exposed, the geology more varied. She could see layers in them like the pages of a book, different colors of stone marking different periods. She had no way of dating, but could see clearly red sandstone over gray limestone over something darker below, the whole sequence tilted at angles that told a story of enormous force and enormous time. Whatever had formed this canyon had not been gentle, and it had not been fast, and it had not been interested in the comfort of anything that came after. She found that reassuring in a complicated way. The canyon was older than any human problem she was carrying. It would be here after she and Ephraim Rusk's and Calder and Redstone Crossing were all equally gone and equally forgotten. That perspective didn't fix anything, but it made the scale of her immediate problems feel somewhat more manageable. She brought Bramble back down the canyon at a pace he set for himself, which was deliberate and thoughtful, and involved several stops she had not planned. Fenwick's spent one more night. Nell was well enough by that final evening to sit up through the whole of dinner without flagging, and she ate real food, not much, but solid, and she told Maren with great seriousness that Bramble was the best mule she had ever met. Maren said she thought so too. Gideon and Laurel packed what they'd retrieved from the wagon, and Gideon looked at the cabin one more time with his carpenter's eye and said quietly to Maren that what she'd built was genuinely good, that the structure was sounder than it looked, and the cave integration was smarter than most people would have thought to attempt. I mean it, he said. I've built a lot of things. You should be proud of this. Maren didn't know what to say to that exactly, so she said, it needs a window. He laughed, which was a good sound in the small room. I'll come back and put one in, he said. That's a promise, not a pleasantry. She believed him. There was something in the way he said it that had the weight of a man who understood what promise was for. They left in the early morning of the fourth day. Gideon on his stick, Nell holding Laurel's hand and turning back twice to wave at Bramble, who watched them go from the cave entrance with his usual expression of measured opinion. Maren stood at the cabin door and watched until the trail bent and took them out of sight, and then she stood there a little longer in the quiet. Canyon was hers again. She was not entirely sure how she felt about that. The 4 days of other people had been exhausting and consuming and had cost her materially in ways she was going to have to work to recover from. They'd also been the first 5 weeks that she'd heard a child laugh, heard adults to her as though she was simply a person they were speaking to rather than a problem to be managed or a girl to be dismissed. The absence of that stepping back into the silence was lonelier than the silence had been before they arrived, because now she had something to measure it against. She went inside and sat down and allowed herself to feel that loneliness for approximately 10 minutes, and then she stood up and went to the back of the cave. She moved the loose stones away from the quartz section carefully, setting each one aside, until the full extent of what she'd exposed in her initial investigation was visible again in the torch's light. Then she picked up her small pick and began, methodically and with great care, to widen the exposed area. She worked at it for the better part of 3 days. She was not trying to extract anything. She didn't have the knowledge or the equipment to do that properly, and she was not going to damage what she didn't understand yet. She was trying to map it, to understand how large the deposit was, how consistent the gold veining was through the quartz, whether what she'd found was a surface concentration, a shallow pocket that petered out quickly, or something that went deeper. What she found was something that went deeper. The quartz vein was not a pocket. It was a seam running through the cave wall at an angle that she traced, with careful picking and brushing, for a distance of at least 12 feet horizontally before the wall curved away from her access. The gold wasn't uniform. Through all of it, there were sections where the white quartz was plain and empty, and sections where the veining was sparse, and sections where it was dense enough that the torchlight caught it from 3 feet away, without any special effort. The dense sections were the ones that made her stop and reset her breathing. She did not know enough to assign a value to what she was looking at. She understood the basic principles of gold-bearing quartz. If the concentration was high enough and the deposit large enough, was worth extracting and processing. She understood that the value depended on factors she couldn't assess with a torch and a pick: the purity of the gold, the total extent of the deposit, the ease of extraction, the cost of processing. She needed someone to know those things. She spent 3 evenings after the mapping work, writing in the back pages of the small account book she'd packed with her provisions, the only paper she had. She wrote down everything she'd observed, the location of the vein within the cave, the approximate dimensions she'd been able to trace, the character of the quartz, the density and distribution of the gold veining as best she could describe it. She made rough sketches in the margins. She wrote with the care of someone creating a document that might matter later, in a legal or official context, and she dated each entry. She was not going to be caught without records again. She had learned in the meeting hall at Redstone Crossing what happened to truth that wasn't written down. Truth without documentation was just a story that a more powerful person could rewrite. This, she was not going to let anyone rewrite. The question of what to do next was the kind of question that required thinking she couldn't do adequately in isolation, because she didn't have all the relevant information. She needed to know, at minimum, 3 things: whether the deposit was legally hers to claim, what the process was for making such a claim in this territory, and who the right person was to help her understand the geology. She needed someone with expertise, and, more critically, someone whose integrity she could trust. She did not have a lot of candidates. Her social network, at present, consisted of a mule, a recently departed family of 3 she'd known for 4 days, and a young blacksmith back in Redstone Crossing who hadn't managed to stand up for her when it counted. She thought about all 3 with the same careful, unsentimental assessment. He applied to everything. Tobin had given her the axe. He had come after her in the dark. He had looked at her with that complicated expression that had apology and fury in it. He had not spoken up in the meeting, which was a failure she had not forgiven, and was not sure she could entirely excuse, but she also understood the specific arithmetic of fear. In a small settlement, where one man controlled most of the things that determined whether a family ate. She had been the one taking the risk. He had been the one weighing what the risk would cost him. She couldn't entirely blame him for the calculation, even though she could, and did, blame him for the outcome. But he was honest. She was sure of that. And he had skills and connections. A blacksmith's apprentice, knew people, dealt with traders, had access to a wider network than a banished girl, alone in a canyon. If she needed to get a message to someone, or find out who the territorial assayer was, or understand the legal process for mineral claims in this region, Tobin Hale was the most useful contact she had. Question was whether she trusted him enough with what she'd found. Telling him about the gold meant putting an extraordinary secret in the hands of a young man who'd already demonstrated, once, that fear could override his better instincts. She turned this over for 2 full days before she arrived at what felt like a reasonable position. She would write to him, not tell him the full scale of what she'd found, but ask him the specific questions she needed answered. Give him enough to be useful, without giving him enough to make the decision dangerous. She wrote the letter in the back pages of her account book, planning to copy it clean when she worked out exactly what she wanted to say, and she worked on it the way she worked on everything, carefully, without rushing, going back and revising when she read it again and found it said something she didn't mean, or left something open she needed closed. The first draft was too cold. She read it and heard a stranger's voice in it, formal and distant. The second draft was too much the other direction. She could feel the isolation of 5 weeks in every sentence, the loneliness finding its way into words she didn't intend. The third draft was something closer to herself, direct, specific, not asking for anything except the information she needed, and ending with one line that she stayed with for a while before deciding to keep it. The line was, "I am not asking you to do anything that puts you at risk. I am asking you to do one small thing that costs you almost nothing, and I want you to understand that this is a test, and that if you pass it, I will trust you with more." She thought that was honest. She thought it was also fair. She left it in. The question then was how to get the letter to him. She had no way to travel to Redstone Crossing without abandoning the canyon for a significant period, which she was not willing to do, not yet, not before she'd secured what she had. She needed a carrier. The answer arrived 11 days for the Fenwick Septics left, in the form of a trading party moving through the canyon trail from the eastern settlements, 2 men with 3-pack mules going west, stopping at the spring to water their animals. They were not from Redstone Crossing and had no connection to Ephraim Rusk, which she established through careful conversation before she asked whether they were passing anywhere near the settlement. The older of the 2, a dry-humored man named Casper, who seemed constitutionally incapable of being surprised by anything, said they'd be through the settlement's trading post area within 4 days. She gave him the letter, and 3 of the pine nuts she'd spent a week accumulating, to roast and sell her only real trade currency, and told him the name of the recipient and where he worked. He looked at the letter, looked at her, looked at the cabin built into the cliff face beside the cave, and said, "You built all that yourself?" "Yes." He nodded once, pocketed the letter, and moved his mules on without further comment. Most of its windows were dark. She watched them go and felt the particular vulnerability of having put something important to the hands of a stranger, a feeling she did not enjoy and could not avoid. Then she went back inside and ate and slept, and woke before light and went to tend her snares, because the canyon did not pause for her anxieties, and she had long since learned that the most reliable antidote to the things she could not control was to focus absolutely on the things she could. 3 weeks passed. She expanded the snare system further up the canyon. She improved the cabin's internal arrangement, building a rough shelf along one wall for provisions and equipment. She found a second stand of cattail in a new location and processed the roots for starch, which was dull and laborious work that she did with grim efficiency because the alternative was running short on food. She continued the slow, methodical mapping of the quartz vein, adding to her notes every time she learned something new about its character. And she waited. She had told herself she was not waiting. She was working and thinking and planning, and whether a reply came or didn't come was information but not a crisis. She told herself that with some regularity and believed it with varying levels of success. The reply came on a gray afternoon with a light rain falling, carried by a boy she didn't recognize, who appeared at the canyon entrance on a spotted horse and said he'd been paid to deliver a letter to a Miss Voss at Hollow Fang Canyon, and that he'd thought whoever sent him was joking about the location. She tipped him one of the roasted pine nut parcels, which he received with the philosophical acceptance of someone accustomed to unusual payment, and she waited until he was back up the trail before she sat downside and opened it. Tobin's handwriting was large and effortful, the handwriting of someone who had not practiced it enough and knew it. The letter was short. He had found the information she asked for. The Territorial Claims Registry was in Copper Vale, the largest town 3 days west. A man named Dr. Hollis Mercer worked out of Copper Vale as the county's registered mineral assayer and geological surveyor. With a reputation Tobin had asked around carefully, he said, without explaining why for being thorough and honest, which, in that profession, was not always the same thing. The process for registering a mineral claim required physical presence, documentation of discovery, and 2 independent witnesses to the location. Then, in smaller letters at the bottom of the page, cramped as though he'd added it after deciding what to say, "I'm sorry I didn't stand up. I've thought about it every day since. I know that doesn't help you. I don't know what does. But if there's something I can do from here that actually matters, something real, tell me what it is." She read that last part twice. Then she folded the letter and put it inside her account book, next to the pages of careful notes and rough sketches that described the most valuable thing she'd ever seen. Dr. Hollis Mercer, Copper Vale, the Territorial Claims Registry. She sat and thought about what came next with the same methodical attention she'd applied to every problem in this canyon, not rushing, not assuming, not letting the size of the thing make her stupid. She needed to get to Copper Vale. She needed to bring documentation. She needed to be smart about who she told and in what order, because the moment this stopped being her secret was the moment other people's interests entered the equation, and other people's interests had a long and reliable history of being more powerful than hers. She thought about Ephraim Rusk and what he would do if word reached him before she had legal protection on the claim. She thought about it with the cold clarity of someone who had already been destroyed once by underestimating how far a powerful man would go to protect himself. She was not going to underestimate that twice. She wrote back to Tobin. This letter was shorter than the first, and it included, for the first time, a portion of what she knew, not everything, but enough. She told him there was something of value in the cave. She told him she needed to reach Dr. Hollis Mercer in Copper Vale without drawing attention, and she needed to do it before anyone from Redstone Crossing had any reason to know she was making any kind of formal legal contact with the territorial system. She told him she needed his help with one specific thing. She needed him to find out when Ephraim Rusk's next plan to travel, so she could be sure her own travel did not coincide. Then she added, because it was true, and because she thought he needed to hear it, what you said about doing something real, this is it. This is the real thing. Don't tell anyone. Not anyone. She sealed it the way she sealed everything now, with care and with the awareness that the world had a long history of reading other people's mail when it suited them. Outside, the rain had let up. The canyon caught the late afternoon light in the way it did after rain, Everything sharp and clean and specific, the water on every surface, catching light and throwing it at angles that turned the ordinary stone walls into something that looked, briefly, like a place that had always intended to be beautiful. Maren stood at her cabin door and looked at it. She thought about Nell laughing at Bramble's smell. She thought about Gideon's saying, "I'll come back and put in a window." That's a promise, not a pleasantry. She thought about Laurel, reorganizing the provision stores with quiet competence in the middle of her own terror. She thought about the gold in the wall, patient as always, waiting in its white quartz bed for whatever came next. What came next was going to be complicated and dangerous, and was going to require more from her than the canyon had asked for yet. She understood that clearly. The wilderness had been the simple part, in its way difficult and physical and demanding but clean in its logic. What was coming was the human part, which was harder and messier, and had no rules she could learn by observation, and no snare system she could build to manage it reliably. But she had survived 35 days in a canyon alone. She had built windows were dark. She had built a house with one axe and a mule. She had kept a 6-year-old girl alive through a night. When the fever was making serious arguments for a different outcome, she was not done yet, not by a very long measure. Bramble appeared at her shoulder, pressing his nose against her coat, demanding the attention he felt he was consistently owed. She reached up and scratched behind his ears without looking away from the canyon in the rain-clean light. "We're going to Copper Vale," she told him. He expressed no opinion either way, which she took as agreement. Tobin's reply came back in 8 days, which was faster than she'd expected, and told her he'd moved on it immediately. Ephraim Rusk was traveling to the Eastern Trade Junction in 12 days' time, a trip that typically kept him away from Redstone Crossing for 5 to 7 days. Calder would be managing the settlement in his absence, which Tobin noted with a single dry sentence. Calder managing anything is an argument for moving quickly that told her more about how things had deteriorated in Redstone Crossing since her banishment than anything more direct would have. 12 days. She had 12 days to prepare, travel 3 days west to Copper Vale, find Dr. Hollis Mercer, conduct whatever examination and documentation process was required, file her claim legally with the Territorial Registry, and get back to the canyon before Ephraim returned and anyone thought to tell him what she'd been doing. It was tight, not impossible, but tight, and it left no room for anything to go wrong, which was the kind of plan she generally distrusted because things went wrong, the way weather went wrong, without consulting your schedule first. She spent 2 days getting ready. She packed everything she'd need with the efficiency of someone who had learned, over the past 2 months, exactly how much weight Bramble could carry over rough trail without becoming uncooperative. She took her account book with all its notes and sketches. 3 samples she'd carefully extracted from the quartz vein, not large pieces, not enough to damage the formation, but representative pieces that showed the gold veining clearly against the white matrix. She wrapped them in cloth and packed them in the center of her provision bag where they wouldn't shift. She took the axe because she wasn't leaving the axe. On the morning of the 3rd day, she rose before light, checked the snares one final time, and reset them for whatever good that would do with no one to run them, made sure Bramble's load was balanced and his feet were sound, and stood for a moment in the doorway of her cabin, looking back at the interior, the rough walls, the dirt floor, the fire she'd let burn down to coals, because she wasn't sure how long she'd be gone, and she wasn't going to leave a live fire in an empty structure. Cave entrance beyond, dark and quiet, with the sound of the spring underneath everything. She'd built this with her hands. She was leaving it to go fight for it in a different arena, one with paperwork and offices and legal language she only partially understood, and the leaving felt strange in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had been angry at this canyon for weeks. She had been lonely in it and cold in it and pushed to the edge of what she was capable of in it. And somewhere along the way, without her permission, it had become hers in a way that had nothing to do with legal documents. She was going to get the legal documents anyway. Because things that were yours by right were still taken from you if you didn't have the paperwork. She'd learned that lesson already. The trail west was different from the canyon, more open. Moving through country that broadened as the canyon walls receded, and the land flattened into rolling high-altitude terrain with wide views and cold wind that had nothing to break it for miles in any direction. Bramble disliked the open terrain on principle and expressed this through a general stubbornness about pace that Maren eventually stopped fighting and simply accommodated, letting him set his own speed within reason. She made camp the first night in a hollow off the main trail, keeping her fire small. She'd thought about what she was doing from a risk perspective, and the analysis wasn't entirely comfortable. She was a young woman traveling alone with a mule, carrying documents and ore samples that represented a claim she hadn't yet secured. Anyone with bad intent and enough geographic knowledge connected what she was carrying with where she'd been living, the situation could turn dangerous in ways she didn't have a clean answer for. She slept lightly and kept the axe beside her bedroll and was back on the trail before full light. Copper Vale announced itself on the afternoon of the third day as a smear of smoke on the western horizon that resolved, over the next 2 hours of travel, into a proper town not large, by the standards of established settlements further east, but substantial enough to have a main street with actual storefronts, a trading post, 3 saloons that she could count from the trail approach, what appeared to be a proper hotel, and enough traffic on the roads to make her and Bramble unremarkable arrivals. She found a livery stable and arranged for Bramble at a price that made her wince, because her cash reserves were essentially the 3 coins she'd been carrying since Redstone Crossing and some of her trade goods, and she couldn't afford to be sentimental about it. Bramble went into the stable with the expression of an animal whose opinion of the entire enterprise had been consistently negative, and who was not surprised to be vindicated. "I'll be back," she told him. He was already investigating his hay. She asked the livery operator about Dr. Hollis Mercer, keeping her voice casual, the tone of someone asking a routine question. The man told her Mercer kept an office above the hardware supply on the north end of the main street, that he was usually in of an afternoon, and that he was the best man in the territory for mineral work, if that's what she needed, which she clearly assumed it wasn't given, and his eyes did the quick assessment that men's eyes did, the one that took in her size and her trail clothes and her youth and her gender, and assembled a rapid conclusion about the likelihood of her having mineral business. She thanked him pleasantly and went to find Mercer's office. The staircase to the second floor was narrow, and the door at the top was plain wood with a painted sign that read, H. Mercer Geological Survey and Mineral Assessment by appointment or by chance. The second half of that she found reassuring in a way she couldn't entirely explain. A man who put by chance on his door was either a fool or someone who understood that most important things in mineral country arrived unannounced. She knocked. The man who opened the door was older than she'd expected, somewhere in his 60s, with white hair cut practically short and a face that was mostly weathered skin over good bone structure, the face of someone who had spent decades outdoors in difficult terrain and had the permanent squint lines to prove it. He was wearing a leather apron over his shirt and had a magnifying loupe pushed up on his forehead. His hands, she noticed immediately, were the hands of someone who worked with them, scarred capable, with the particular staining around the nails that she'd come to associate with men who dealt regularly with stone and mineral. He looked at her the way the liveryman had not, directly, without the quick dismissive assessment. His eyes went to her face first, then her trail pack, then back to her face. "Miss," he said, "what can I do for you?" "My name is Maren Voss. I have a mineral deposit I need assessed and a claim I need to understand how to file. Told you're the right person." He considered that for a moment. "Who told you?" "The livery operator. And before that, someone in Redstone Crossing who'd asked around about your reputation." Something shifted in his expression at the mention of Redstone Crossing. Not alarm, more like a careful attention. "Come in," he said. "Let me hear it." His office was the kind of organized chaos that belongs to someone who knows exactly where everything is and whose system would be incomprehensible to anyone else. Rocks and 4 samples covered every flat surface, labeled in small, precise handwriting. Maps on 3 walls, layered over each other. A large desk with a proper lamp, currently burning against the gray afternoon light. 2 chairs that had seen serious use. He gestured her to one and took the other, and she sat down and opened her account book to the first page of notes and began. She told it the same way she told everything, in order, without embellishment, with specifics wherever she had them. Cave location, the discovery sequence. The mapping she'd done over 3 days. The character of the quartz vein as she'd been able to observe it, the distribution of the gold veining, the estimated extent of what she could trace. She showed him the sketches she'd made in the margins. She told him about covering the discovery, about recording everything with dates. She did not tell him yet about Redstone Crossing, about the banishment, about Ephraim Rusk. When she finished, he sat with his hands folded and looked at the account book for a moment. How long ago did you find this? About 6 weeks after I arrived in the canyon. I've been there approximately 2.5 months total. And you've told no one? I've told one person that there's something of value. Not the specifics. Who? Someone in Redstone Crossing. Someone I believe I can trust. She paused. Someone I need to be able to trust, which is a different thing, and I'm aware of the difference. He looked at her more carefully then. How old are you? 19. He made a sound that was not quite a word. Then he said, May I see the samples? She unpacked them from her bag and set them on his desk. He picked up the first one, brought it under the lamp, and pulled the loop down over his eye. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he set it down and picked up the second one. Then the third. The silence in the room had the quality of concentrated attention, and she let it sit without filling it, because she had learned that the impulse to fill silence was something that benefited the person who could resist it. Finally, he set the third sample down and pushed the loop back up to his forehead and looked at her. These are real, he said. I know. The concentration is, this is not a flake deposit. The vein is as extensive as your notes suggest. This is a significant find. He tapped the second sample. This section here, this density, if this is representative of what's in the wall rather than exceptional, it's representative. I mapped it across 12 feet of exposed face, and the density is consistent in the sections I marked as primary. It creases toward what I think is the center of the seam. He looked at her for another moment. Where did you learn to observe like this? I listened, she said, and I wrote things down. He sat back in his chair and studied the ceiling briefly. All right, tell me the rest of it. There's a rest of it, and it involves Redstone Crossing, and I want to hear it before we talk about what comes next. She told him the rest of it. The full story this time, Pell, the meeting hall, Ephraim's fist on the table, the tin cups, the banishment, Hollow Fang Canyon offered as a place to disappear and die. She told it the same way flat, in order, without performing the anger, though the anger was there under the surface of every sentence in the way heat is under stone that's been in sun all day. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, Ephraim Rusk. You know him? I know of him. He filed a land claim in this office 3 years ago. Standard settlement expansion. I processed it without issue. He paused. He was courteous, efficient. The kind of man who makes a particular impression, very controlled, very aware of how he presents himself. Yes, Maren said. That's him. And you need to file before he finds out what you found. I need to file before he has any reason to come looking. Right now he has no reason. In 12 days he comes back from the Eastern Junction, and whatever Calder has done in his absence, which, given Calder's track record, may have created its own problems, will require his attention. If I have legal documentation before then, any claim he tries to make on the property after the fact runs into the territorial registry. If I don't, she stopped. If you don't, Mercer said carefully, then you're a young woman with an exciting story about a cave full of gold. And the person contesting that story is a man with established settlement authority and a lawyer. Yes. He stood up and moved to one of the wall maps, a large territorial survey, hand-annotated in several different colors of ink over what appeared to be years. He found Hollow Fang Canyon in approximately 3 seconds, which told her he knew this territory, the intimacy of someone who had walked most of it. This is your location? He pointed. Yes. The cave is here? He indicated a specific point along the canyon line. Yes. The entrance faces southwest. The quartz vein is in the north wall of the interior, approximately 40 to 50 feet from the entrance. He made a small notation on the map in pencil. The canyon is not under any existing claim. There was a survey through herein. He went to his desk and pulled a folder from a stack that she would not have been able to identify as distinct from any other stack. But he found it in seconds, 8 years ago, categorized as low-value terrain. No mineral survey was conducted because the surface indicators were unpromising. He looked up. Whoever did the surface assessment didn't go inside the cave. No one did, Maren said. They sent people there to die, not to look for gold. Mercer looked at her for a moment. I'll need to conduct a field assessment to complete the documentation properly. The registry requires an independent expert assessment for mineral claims above a certain value threshold, which this certainly is. That means I need to come to Hollow Fang Canyon. When? I can leave in 3 days. I'd want 2 days on site for a thorough assessment. We'd be back here within a week if the weather holds. Maren did the arithmetic quickly. That was tight against her 12-day window, but workable if nothing went wrong. All right, there's the matter of my fee, he said. It was not apologetic, just direct. The way practical matters stated plainly are neither aggressive nor awkward. For a claim of this potential value, the appropriate arrangement is a survey fee paid up front and so small retained percentage of the claim's production value going forward, standard industry practice. The upfront fee I can keep low given that you are clearly not in a position to pay a large sum at present. How low is low? He named a number. It was almost exactly what she had in coin and trade value combined. She looked at him. I'm not trying to take advantage of your position, he said. That's my minimum. If the claim is what your samples suggest, you will have the means to pay it, and considerably more within a reasonable time. And the percentage? 2% of net production. That's industry standard for independent assessment. Some assessors take 5. I take 2. She thought about it. She thought about what Ephraim Rusk would take if he got there first. She thought about Calder's smile and the tin cups on the floor and the sound of someone saying the wilderness would remind her of her place. Deal, she said. They shook hands. His grip was firm and brief, the handshake of someone for whom it was a serious form of commitment rather than a social gesture. He put her up in the hotel that night out of his own pocket, he said, without making a thing of it, and she accepted without arguing, because she was too tired to be proud about it, and she needed the sleep. The room was small, and the bed was not soft, but it was inside and warm, and had a door that locked, and she lay in the dark for a while listening to Copper Vale going about its evening business outside the window, and thinking about all the things that could still go wrong. There were several. She cataloged them, assigned each a rough probability, identified what she could do to reduce each risk, and then made herself stop because the cataloging was becoming a way of not sleeping. And not sleeping was a risk she could definitively control. She slept. Mercer was ready at first light 3 days later, as he'd promised. He traveled with a pack horse and his own considerable equipment, sampling tools, scales, chemical testing materials, a proper survey kit with instruments she recognized by sight but couldn't have named in detail. He traveled efficiently without complaint, at a pace that suggested he was in considerably better condition than his age might have implied. He asked her questions on the trail, technical questions about the cave formation, the spring, the rock matrix surrounding the quartz, and listened to her answers with the focused attention of someone who was already working. He asked, on the afternoon of the first day, how she'd managed the building. She told him, matter-of-factly, and he listened without comment until she got to the part about reconfiguring the back wall to tie into the cave formation. And then he said, that's a structurally sound approach, better than trying to span the full width independently. I figured that out after I'd already done it wrong once. Most people figure it out after they've done it wrong and then give up, he said. There's a significant difference. She didn't answer that. They rode on. He saw the cabin before they reached the canyon floor from the trail's last switchback, and she watched him register it, the way his head came up and his eyes went to it with the specific alertness of a man who builds a picture from evidence and had just been given significant new evidence. You built that since you arrived, he said. Not a question. Yes. In what time frame? The walls were up in about 5 weeks. The roof took another 10 days. He was quiet for a moment. By yourself. Me and Bramble. He looked at the mule. Pulled the logs? He pulled what he decided to pull, she said, which was most of them. Mercer's field assessment took 2 full days and part of a third morning, and it was unlike anything she'd expected in that it was genuinely thorough in a way that made her previous careful observations feel amateur by comparison. He worked systematically across the entire cave, not just the section she'd identified, taking rock samples at regular intervals, measuring and recording the geology with instruments she watched him use with the patient expertise of someone who had been doing this for decades. He tested samples in the field with acid solutions that produced reactions she logged in her mind for future reference. He took the full measure of the exposed quartz vein with a thoroughness that required most of the second day. She gave him space to work and used the time to attend to the things that had needed attention while she'd been away: the snares, the provision inventory, checking the cabin structure after the travel interval. Gideon had been right that the door frame was better now, and she could feel the difference in the way the hide door hung when she came back to it. Small improvements accumulated. She was starting to understand that about building, it was never finished, just further along. On the evening of the second day, Mercer came to the fire and sat down and took the cup of tea she offered and held it in both hands for a moment without speaking. "Tell me," she said. "The deposit is extensive," he said. "More extensive than what you could see from your exposed section. I found continuation indicators in the rock formation going at least another 20 feet beyond the exposed face, and the structural geology suggests the seam may extend further than that. I'd need to probe deeper to be certain. The gold concentration in the primary sections is genuinely high. I've assessed a lot of deposits. This is," he stopped. "What? This is the kind of find that people spend careers looking for," he said, "and most of them don't find it." The fire crackled. Bramble was a dark shape at the back of the cave. The spring made its steady sound somewhere below them. "How do I protect it?" she asked. "We go back to Copper Vale. We file the claim documents at the registry, with my assessment report attached. You become, in the legal record, the discoverer of record with the earliest documented observation date, which, based on your account book entries, is well established. After that, any challenge to your claim runs into dated documentation, an expert assessment, and the territorial claim registry. It's not of its window to challenge, but it's difficult and expensive, and it requires the challenger to prove either that they have a prior claim or that your filing is fraudulent. Ephraim Rusk has no prior claim on this canyon." "No, he doesn't." "Then what's his argument?" Mercer looked at her steadily. "Men like Ephraim Rusk don't always need an argument. They need enough money to hire people who will make arguments for them. I want you to understand that filing the claim is the essential step. It changes the landscape considerably, but it doesn't end the risk. You will need legal representation, eventually. You will need money to secure that, which the claim will provide. And you will need," he paused, choosing his word carefully, "you will need to be strategic about how this becomes public knowledge, and in what sequence." She had already been thinking about that. "The Fenwicks," she said. "Gideon Fenwick, the man whose family I took in during the storm. He said he'd come back. He's a carpenter. A witness? A potential one. He was here in the cave. He saw the quartz section before I covered it, though I don't think he identified what it was. And he has reason to want to be helpful." She thought about Gideon's face when he'd said, "I'll come back and put in a window." The weight of that. He's an honest man. You'd need 2 independent witnesses for the claim documentation. I count as the expert assessor. A second civilian witness strengthens the record considerably. How do I reach him? Where was he going? She described the destination. Gideon had mentioned his wife's sister's settlement 3 days east. Mercer knew the area and said there was a postal relay through Copper Vale that served it. A letter would take 4 or 5 days to arrive if sent immediately. She wrote to Gideon that night by firelight, sitting cross-legged on the cave floor with her account book open on her knee, and Mercer reading one of his field journals on the other side of the fire. She wrote it plainly. She had something she needed to tell him. She needed his help with something specific and legal. She would understand completely if the answer was no, but she was asking him to come to Hollow Fang Canyon when he was able, and she would explain everything when he arrived. She paused at the end and added, "Nell is the reason I'm able to ask this. You came through my door and I opened it, and what happened after that changed what's possible for me. I wanted you to know that before you decide." She wasn't sure it was the right thing to say, but it was true, and she had decided early in this process that she was going to operate from truth wherever possible, because she had seen what happened to truth that got managed and shaped and trimmed to fit what someone else needed it to be, and she wanted no part of that. They broke camp the next morning and made the return trip to Copper Vale in 2 hard days. Mercer was efficient on the trail in the way he was efficient everywhere. No wasted movement, no unnecessary conversation, but not unfriendly. On the second afternoon, when they were close enough to Copper Vale to see the smoke, he said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask. What are you going to do with it?" "The claim. When it's secure and producing." She'd been thinking about that for weeks, in the spaces between the immediate problems. She'd thought about it the way you think about something that's too large to look at directly in pieces, from angles, letting the full picture assemble slowly. "I'm going to do something useful with it," she said. "I haven't worked out all the specifics. Most people in your position would take the money and go somewhere easier. I know you're not going to do that." It wasn't a question. She considered why he was certain and decided he'd read it accurately, and there was no point in being coy about it. "The canyon needs people," she said. "Proper people with proper skills building something that lasts. It needs a carpenter and a blacksmith and families who need a place to belong. It needs roads and water management and a system for organizing the mining that doesn't destroy the land faster than the land can be useful." She paused. "It needs someone making decisions who isn't Ephraim Rusk." Mercer was quiet for a moment. "You're going to build a settlement. I'm going to build something better than what Redstone Crossing became," she said. "That's all I've decided for certain." He looked at the road ahead, and something moved in his expression that she couldn't entirely read, something that might have been respect, or might have been the older and more complex feeling of recognizing in a young person something that time and difficulty have made scarce in oneself. "I'll help where I can," he said. "That's not part of our professional arrangement. Personal offer." "I'll take it," she said. "Thank you." The Territorial Claims Registry in Copper Vale was housed in a stone building on the south side of town that looked more permanent than anything else in the area, which she suspected was deliberate permanence, being the primary attribute you wanted in the institution that kept track of who owned what. The registrar was a narrow man of indeterminate middle age with ink-stained fingers, and the slightly harassed expression of someone was perpetually 2 weeks behind in their filing. Mercer held the technical portions of the documentation with an expertise that she watched carefully and filed away for future reference. He'd prepared the assessment report on the return trip in a neat hand that was clearly the product of having written hundreds of such reports, and he walked the registrar through it with a calm authority that did not permit interruption or distraction. The registrar looked up at Maren at one point during the process with the particular expression of a bureaucrat confronting a category he hadn't encountered before, and said, "And you are the sole discoverer of record?" "I am. This is the canyon in question is quite remote." "Yes." "And you've been living there how long?" 2.5 months. He looked at her, then at Mercer, then back at the documents. "Alone?" "Me and my mule," she said, which she was beginning to feel was her standard answer to this question in any official context. He processed the claim. It took 3 hours and involved more paper than she'd expected, and several socials, Mercer told her quietly, were each significant in specific ways she should understand. And he would explain later. When it was done, the registrar handed her a folded document with a seal at the bottom and told her that the Hollow Fang Canyon mineral claim, Primary's discoverer Maren Voss, was entered in the Territorial Registry as of today's date with Dr. Hollis Mercer's expert assessment filed as supporting documentation. She held the document and looked at it for a moment. She thought about Ephraim Rusk saying, "Get her out," in his quiet, controlled voice. She thought about tin cups hitting a dirt floor. She thought about someone in the back of a room suggesting the wilderness would remind her of her place. The document was real. The seal was real. The registry entry was real. These were things that existed in the world now, independent of what any powerful man in Redstone Crossing thought about them or wanted to be true. She folded it carefully and put it inside her account book, next to Tobin's letters, and her own careful notes, and the rough sketches of a gold vein that had been sitting in a cave wall for longer than Redstone's Crossing had existed. Gideon's reply came to Copper Vale. She'd sent his letter from there before leaving, and Mercer had offered his office address for the return in 6 days, which was fast enough that she knew he'd moved immediately. He wrote that he would come. He wrote that Laurel had read the letter and told him to go before he'd finished reading it aloud, which Maren believed completely. He wrote that he didn't know exactly what she needed, but that she'd kept his daughter alive in a blizzard, with no tools and her own knowledge, and if she needed him to stand in a canyon and say what he'd seen, he'd stand there as long as she needed. Then, in handwriting that got larger and less careful toward the end, the handwriting of a man whose feelings were outrunning his penmanship, Nels asks about the mule. I told her Bramble was probably fine. I hope that's true. Maren read it twice and felt something in her chest that had been compressed for a long time shift slightly, the way a joint shifts when it's finally been moved in the right direction after a long period of being held wrong. She wrote back immediately, Bramble is fine. He has opinions about everything and shares them freely. Come when you can. I have things to show you. Mercer had helped her understand, in the days since the filing, the practical next steps, securing a proper legal representative in Copper Vale, which he assisted with from his own professional relationships. A woman named Aldridge, who had a reputation for frontier property law that was described as formidable and expensive, and who turned out to be a direct, unimpressed woman in her 40s, who listened to Maren's full account without interrupting, and then said the claim documentation was solid and the primary risk was someone filing a fraudulent counterclaim which she could defend against, and her fee was what it was, and the timeline was what the law required. Maren paid the retainer from the cash she had and signed an agreement for the balance from future proceeds, which all of its windows were dark, which Aldridge accepted with the brisk lack of sentiment of someone who had made the same calculation about frontier clients many times before and had learned which ones were worth the extension of credit. She was 10 days into her 12-day window when she finally turned Bramble back toward the east and the canyon. She had a registered mineral claim. She had an expert assessment on file. She had a legal representative. She had a carpenter coming to provide civilian witness testimony. She had in the account book in her pack the most important document she'd ever held. What she did not have yet was any certainty about what Ephraim Rusk would do when he found out. And she was clear-eyed enough to know that finding out was not a matter of if. It was when, and she did not have full control over the when, only over how well she was positioned when it arrived. She made the trip back to the canyon in 2.5 days, pushing harder than was strictly comfortable. Bramble expressed his views on the pace, and she listened to them and kept moving. The trails was familiar now in a way it hadn't been on the way out. She knew where the footing was bad, where the wind came off the upper walls at the worst angle, where the switchback required patience rather than speed. Canyon received her in the same way it always did, with the complete indifference of stone and elevation and old water. She went inside and rebuilt the fire from the coals she'd banked before leaving, which had gone out, and rebuilt it from new, and sat in the warmth of it in the cabin she'd built with her hands, in the canyon she'd been sent to die in, with the legal document in her account book and the gold behind her in the wall. She was not done. She knew that clearly. The legal claim was a wall, not a victory. Walls got tested. She was going to have to hold this one. But she was still here. That fact continued to matter more than she sometimes gave it credit for. She had been told, explicitly, by the arithmetic of her situation and the explicit words of powerful people, that she would not be here. Every day she was still here was evidence against the verdict that had been passed on her in that meeting hall. She added up the evidence quietly, without ceremony. Then she went to check on her snares, because the canyon's indifference to human drama did not extend to feeding her for free, and she had work to do before dark. Gideon Fenwick arrived on a Tuesday, which Maren knew only because she'd been marking days in her account book since the beginning and had recently started caring about the week again, the way you start caring about calendars when the world beyond the canyon starts mattering to your plans. He came down the switchback trail on a brown horse with a pack mule behind him, a different mule from any she knew, dark, and she registered the irony of that, with something close to amusement, and he looked better than he had the last time she'd seen him, which had been pale and limping and held together by stubbornness. The ankle had healed. He moved easily down the trail. He had a carpenter's tool chest roped to the pack mule's left side and a look on his face when he spotted the Caspian that she recognized from the first time Mercer had seen it from the upper trail, the involuntary arrest of a person encountering something they hadn't expected. She was at the fire when he came into the canyon floor. feeding it the morning's first wood, and Bramble, who had expressed studied indifference to most things for the duration of their acquaintance, lifted his head from the water trough she'd constructed from a hollowed log and regarded the newcomers with what appeared to be mild interest. Nell sent something for him, Gideon said, swinging down from the horse. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small cloth bundle. Said it was apple pieces dried from their winter stores. She made me promise to give them to him first thing. Maren took the bundle and looked at it. Then she fed it to Bramble piece by piece, while Gideon tied off his animals and looked around the canyon with the slow, thorough attention of someone taking inventory. "You built more," he said. The lean-to-shelter on the south side of the cabin, the water channel she'd dug from the spring's surface runoff, the log bench outside the door that she'd constructed during a week of unusually calm weather and had been using in the evenings. Since we were here, I had time. He looked at her for a moment. "Your letter said you had things to show me." "I do. But eat something first. The trail takes it out of you." He sat inside with a bowl of the rabbit stew she'd had going since morning. She'd known approximately when he'd arrived based on the trail distance from the relay point where he'd sent his last message, and he ate with the appetite of a man who'd been 3 days on the road, and she gave him space to do it and sat across the fire and thought about how to begin. She showed him the account book first. All of it from the first day's entry through the gold discovery, through the Copper Vale trip, and the filed claim documentation. She put it in front of him and let him read it, which took a long time because there was a lot of it, and Gideon was the kind of reader who did it thoroughly or not at all. When he looked up, his face had gone very still in the way faces go still when information has arrived that's larger than the immediate capacity to process it. "The wall," he said. "When we were here, the loose stone." "Yes, I thought you were." "I don't know what I thought." "Storing something. I'd covered it 2 days before you arrived. I hadn't decided yet what to do about it." He looked back at the account book, then at the cave entrance, then at her. "And you filed the claim. 2 weeks ago. It's registered. Mercer's assessment is attached. Aldridge, she's the legal representative in Copper Vale, has a copy of the full documentation." She paused. "I need you to go on record as a civilian witness. You were here. You were in the cave. You saw the quartz section before I covered it, even if you didn't know what it was." "I'll do it," he said, without hesitation, without the pause of a man calculating personal cost. "Just, I'll do it. Whatever you need me to say, and wherever you need me to say it." She had been prepared to make an argument. The absence of any need for one left her briefly at a loss, and she covered it by refilling his bowl, which he accepted without comment. "Laurel wants to know if you need people," he said after a moment. "Not asking for charity. She means workers, families. People who can actually build something." He set the bowl down and looked at her directly. "I've been thinking about what you wrote, about doing something useful with it. And I've been talking to Laurel about whether there are people we know who are in the situation we were in, looking for somewhere to go that isn't already owned by someone who resents them for arriving." Maren looked at the fire. The things she'd said to Mercer on the road about building something better than what Redstone Crossing had become was taking a shape in her mind that was more specific now than it had been when she'd first said it. It had corners and dimensions and requirements. It had a labor problem and an infrastructure problem and a legal organization problem that she hadn't solved yet. "How many people are you talking about?" "3 families I know personally. 2 more that Laurel's sister's husband knows. All of them are good people. All of them know how to work. Do any of them know anything about mining? One man fellow named Pratt, he worked a silver claim for 4 years in his 30s. Knows the process." She thought about Mercer's guidance on this. You don't operate a significant gold deposit with an axe and a mule. You need equipment. You need personnel who understand the extraction process. You need a system for processing the ore. You need to sell the output through legitimate channels. All of that required capital she didn't yet have access to from the claim itself, which required a period of transition that was both necessary and dangerous. Necessary because you couldn't skip the infrastructure step. Dangerous because the gap between having a registered claim and having actual income from it was exactly the window when someone like Ephraim Rusk could cause the most damage. "Tell them to come," she said, "but tell them what it is first. It's a canyon. It's cold in winter, and the trail is rough, and there are no stores, no established roads, no doctor within 3 days' ride. Tell them exactly what they're coming to and let them decide with their eyes open." Gideon nodded. "That's how I'd want it told to me." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm telling you to tell it that way." He stayed 4 days. He put in the window a proper one, with a wooden frame and oiled paper stretched across it that let in light without letting in wind, and she stood inside and looked at the light coming through it and felt, for the first time, that the cabin was a house rather than a survival structure. The distinction mattered to her more than she'd expected. He also looked at the broader canyon with his carpenter's eye and walked the floor and the lower slopes and told her where he thought a road could go and where the first additional structures should be sited to. Get maximum shelter from the canyon walls in winter. He had opinions, and he expressed them clearly, and when she disagreed with 2 of them, she said so and explained why, and he considered it and said she was right on one, and he stood by the other, and they argued it for 20 minutes on the canyon floor, with Bramble watching them both, and eventually agreed on a compromise that was probably better than either original position. On the 4th evening, he looked at the cave wall, the full exposed section now, properly lit with 2 torches, scope is, so he could see the scope of it, and stood there for a long time without speaking. "This is the thing that changes everything," he said. "It was already changing," Maren said. "The canyon was already changing. This just means it changes on my terms instead of someone else's. Rusk doesn't know yet. No. When he finds out there's a registered claim in the territorial registry with an expert assessment, and 2 civilian witnesses and a legal representative who has seen people like Ephraim Rusk before and found them manageable." She paused. "I'm not worried about it. I'm just not going to let the worry make me passive." Gideon filed his witness testimony in a written declaration that Maren had prepared from Aldridge's guidance, signed it, and gave it to her to send to Copper Vale. He left on the 5th morning with a list of names and locations for the families he'd mentioned, and a promise to send word ahead of their arrival, so she'd know to expect them. He also left, tied to the fence post of the lean-to, a leather satchel containing a set of woodworking tools he said he had doubles of and didn't need both sets for, which was possibly true and possibly not, and she accepted them without investigating the claim because the tools were useful, and the gesture was the kind that required receiving without argument. She was alone in the canyon again for 3 weeks after he left. Those 3 weeks were the most productive she'd had, not physically, though she worked hard, but in terms of thinking. She had reached the phase of this situation where the most important work was happening in her head rather than with her hands. And she was learning to treat that as work rather than as the uncomfortable alternative to work that it had always felt like before. She thought about structure, not the structure of buildings, but the structure of what she was creating, what kind of place Hollow Fang Canyon was going to be, what rules it would run on, what she wanted to be true about it that had not been true about Redstone Crossing. She wrote those things down too, in the account book that was running out of pages and would need replacing soon, which felt like a kind of milestone. She thought about Pell, the 7-year-old boy with the serious eyes and the smooth stone in his pocket. She did not know what had happened to him or his family since the night Ephraim had cut their rations. That not knowing was the thing that kept her anger banked and red rather than cooling to something she could put away. She could not do anything about Pell from here. Not yet. But she was adding it to the list of things she would address when the list became actionable. The first family arrived 5 weeks after Gideon left. They were not one of the families he'd mentioned. They were a couple named Sadie and Walt Corbin, traveling with 2 teenage sons and a goat that had strong opinions about everything. Most of its windows were dark, and they had heard about the canyon from someone who'd heard about it, from someone who'd spoken to Gideon. The information passing through 3 or 4 hands and arriving somewhat garbled, but with the essential fact intact. There was a woman in Hollow Fang Canyon building something, and she needed people who knew how to work. Sadie Corbin was 43 and had the hands of a woman who had spent 20 years making something from nothing in various hostile places, and she looked at the cabin and the lean-to and the water channel and the supply system Maren had built and said, flatly and without preamble, "This is good work." "What do you need?" "What can you do?" Maren asked. "Walt builds. I cook. I manage stores. I know how to organize people without making them feel managed. The boys are strong, and they do what they're told about 70% of the time. which is all you can reasonably ask of boys their age. Maren found a place for them in the lean-to, while Walt and the older boy began work on a second structure along the south wall of the canyon that she'd already planned the footprint for. She found that having people in the canyon changed her relationship to the work in ways she hadn't anticipated, not just because there were more hands, but because the decisions she made were no longer only about herself, and the weight of that was significant and real. And also she found energizing in a way that the solitary work had not been. Gideon arrived again 6 weeks after the Corbins, this time with 2 of the families he'd promised, and a man named Pratt who had the weathered, specific look of someone who had spent time underground and come back from it with opinions about geology that were practical rather than theoretical. Pratt walked into the cave, looked at the quartz vein for about 90 seconds, and said, "You're going to need a proper stamping mill eventually. For now, you can work the surface ore with what you've got. But the vein's going to go deeper, and when it does, you need the right equipment." "What's the timeline on eventually?" Maren asked. "Depends how fast you want to move. Slow and careful, you've got 6 months before you're limited by equipment. Push it, 3. What's the cost of the equipment?" He gave her a number. It was large. She looked at it steadily and thought about what had told her about the preliminary value estimate on the deposit, which was also large, considerably larger than the equipment cost, and did the arithmetic with the patience of someone who had been doing this kind of math since before the canyon, since the years of managing her mother's illness and her father's drinking on a budget that had no room for anything to go wrong. 6 months, she said, slow and careful, and we document everything from the first day of extraction. Pratt nodded. He had the manner of a man who appreciated decisions made on solid ground rather than optimism. I can work with that. What happened over the next 4 months was not a transformation, because transformations imply something quick and complete, and this was neither. It was an accumulation. The way the cabin had accumulated log by log, decision by decision, problem sim solved. And next problem identified the settlement accumulated, and what it became was the product of every choice Maren made, and every person who arrived, and every argument about where to put the road, or how to organize the store, or what the fair share of the first ore proceeds should be for. The people who'd invested their labor in Extraction C. She made mistakes. She granted one of Walt's sons a responsibility he wasn't ready for and had to rescind it, which cost her 2 days of bad feeling that she addressed directly and without ceremony, and that resolved more cleanly than she'd expected. She miscalculated a timber order, and they ran short at a critical moment. She had a genuine, serious argument with Pratt about the extraction pace that lasted 3 days and involved raised voices on at least one occasion, his, not hers, though she wasn't certain she'd been entirely quiet, and ended with a compromise that neither of them loved, and both of them could live with. She was also, in these months, waiting. Most of its windows were dark. Not passively, there was nothing passive about her days, but in the back of everything she was doing, she was tracking the question of when the information would reach Ephraim Rusk and what he would do when it did. The answer came in the form of a letter from Aldridge, delivered by a relay rider in early spring. Ephraim Rusk had filed a counter-petition with the Territorial Registry, challenging Maren's claim on the grounds that Hollow Fang Canyon fell within the geographic boundaries of Redstone Crossing's original settlement charter, and that any mineral discoveries within those boundaries were therefore subject to the charter's collective ownership provisions, which granted the settlement founder, Ephraim Rusk, administrative authority over resource development. She read it twice. Then she read the second page, which was Aldridge's assessment of the counter-petition, which said, in the careful language of someone who had learned to express contempt professionally, the argument was creative, the legal basis was weak, the charter language was general and had never been applied to mineral rights specifically, and the claim would require Rusk to prove in a territorial hearing that the canyon fell within his charter's geographic scope, which it probably did not. Probably. That was the word she stayed with. She wrote to Aldridge immediately and authorized her to defend the claim at full expense, which was a significant commitment against future proceeds, and which she made without hesitation because there was no version of this where she watched someone like Ephraim Rusk take this from a position of financial caution. She also wrote to Tobin Hale, This letter was the longest she'd written to him. She told him what had happened, the claim, the counter-petition, the hearing that Aldridge said would be scheduled within 60 days. She told him she wasn't asking him to do anything dangerous, but she also told him that there was a hearing coming, and that the hearing was going to involve questions about Redstone Crossing's original charter and what it covered, and that if there were people in the settlement who had been told things about what the charter meant and what rights it gave Ephraim Rusk that did not match the actual document, those people might have useful information. Then she added at the end, "You said you wanted to do something real. I think this might be it, if you're willing. But I mean it only if you're willing. I'm not asking you to risk more than you can carry." Tobin's reply came back in 9 days. He had talked to 4 families in Redstone Crossing who had original charter documents copies that Ephraim had distributed when the settlement was founded. He had compared them with a copy of the master charter that was filed at the territorial registry, which Tobin had, with considerable effort and what he described as a cover story he was not proud of, managed to obtain a look at through a contact in Copper Vale. They were different, not dramatically different, but different in one specific place, the geographic boundary description. The filed master charter described the settlement's geographic scope in terms that specifically excluded the canyon system to the west, which the original settlement committee had deemed unusable terrain not worth incorporating. The distributed copies, the ones Ephraim had given to settlers, described the boundary in terms that were noticeably vaguer on the western edge. Tobin had written this out carefully with reference to the specific language in both documents, in the handwriting that was too large and effortful and entirely genuine. At the bottom he'd written, "I should have said this a long time ago. Better late than not." Maren sat with that letter for a long time. She thought about what it meant not just legally, which was significant, but in the broader sense. Ephraim Rusk had been managing the boundaries of what people knew about their own charter for years. The geographic discrepancy was not an accident. It was the act of a man who understood that control of information was control of people, and who had practiced that understanding carefully and for a long time. She was not surprised. She was, underneath the lack of surprise, deeply and coldly angry in a way that had nothing to do with what he'd done to her personally. She'd made her peace with what he'd done to her personally. This was about Pell's family, and the families whose land claims Ephraim had shaped with his administrative authority over people who didn't know the full terms of the document they'd signed. This was about the years of small adjustments and subtle pressures that added up to a community that could not see its own situation clearly. She sent Tobin's letter to Aldridge with a note that said, "I think this is important. I think you'll know what to do with it." Aldridge knew what to do with it. The territorial hearing took place 63 days after the counter-petition was filed, in a proper hearing room in Copper Vale, with a territorial administrator presiding. Maren attended with Aldridge beside her, and Mercer available as expert witness, and Gideon Fenwick in the seats behind her, solid and present in the way that certain people are simply present in a way you can feel without looking. Ephraim Rusk attended with his lawyer, a man from the eastern settlements with an expensive coat and the carefully neutral expression of someone paid to be reasonable in situations that require being unreasonable. Calder was not present. She noted that absence and filed it as information. She saw Ephraim clearly for the first time since the meeting hall. He was the same man, controlled, well-presented, carrying himself with the settled authority of someone who had not yet encountered a situation that seriously challenged his idea of himself. He saw her at almost the same moment she saw him, and something moved through his expression that she had not expected, not anger, not contempt, something closer to discomfort. The discomfort of a man who had assigned someone to a category handled, gone, finished, and was now being required to reclassify. She held his gaze for exactly long enough to make the point. Then she turned back to Aldridge and the papers in front of her. The hearing was 3 hours. Aldridge presented the claim documentation, the discovery record, Mercer's assessment, the civilian witness declarations. She presented the geographic boundary analysis, the comparison between the filed charter and the distributed copies of specific language difference, marked and referenced. She did this without drama, in the flat informational tone of someone who understood that the facts were dramatic enough without help. Ephraim's lawyer argued the charter boundary question skillfully. He was good at his job, she gave him that. He found 4 different ways to say that the geographic language discrepancy was a copying error rather than an intentional alteration, and he said all 4 with the convincing ease of someone who had made similar arguments in similar rooms before. The administrator asked Ephraim directly whether he was aware of the discrepancy between the filed charter and the distributed copies. Ephraim said he was not. The administrator looked at the 2 documents for a long moment. Then, he asked whether Ephraim could explain why the distributed copies, which he had personally overseen the production of, used different language to describe the western boundary than the filed original. Ephraim said he could not explain it with certainty, that it was a long time ago, that there had been many documents involved in the settlement's founding. The administrator looked at him for another moment, with the expression of a man who has been processing information professionally for many years and has a well-developed sense of when an explanation is an explanation and when it is the shape of one. He denied the counter-petition. He denied it on the grounds that the geographic boundary argument was not supported by the filed charter document, which was the controlling legal instrument, and that the claimant Maren Voss had established clear prior discovery with documentation, expert assessment, and civilian witness testimony that the counter-petition had failed to meaningfully challenge. The room was not dramatic about it. Nobody in a hearing room stood up and cheered. The administrator stated his finding in administrative language and noted that his ruling would be entered in the registry record, and Aldridge wrote something in her notebook, and Mercer in the row behind them exhaled once in a specific way, and Gideon's hand came briefly onto Maren's shoulder and then withdrew. She looked at the table in front of her and breathed. Across the room, Ephraim Rusk sat very still for a moment. Then he stood, and he did something she had not expected. He looked at her directly. Across the room, with an expression she could not fully read something in it that was not concession exactly, but was the thing that precedes concession in a man who has never had to practice it. He did not say anything. He gathered his papers and turned and walked out with his lawyer. She watched him go. She felt less than she'd expected to feel. Less triumph, less release, less of the specific satisfaction she'd imagined in the canyon when she was banking her fury and promising herself this day would come. What she felt was more like the end of a long physical effort, the feeling, after you set down something heavy that you've been carrying so long you stopped noticing the weight, the absence of it more than anything else. Outside the hearing room, in the corridor that smelled of pine boards and institutional lamp oil, Mercer shook her hand and said simply, "Well done." Gideon pulled her into a hug that she tolerated, and then returned with more genuine feeling than she'd planned. Because it turned out that being held upright by another person after a long period of holding yourself upright was something her body had views about. "What happens now?" Gideon asked, when she'd stepped back. "Now," she said, "we go back to the canyon and we build what we said we were going to build. What happened in the months and were dark, what happened in the months and years that's ordinary, in the best possible sense ordinary, the way things become ordinary when they've been fought for hard enough that they lose their fragility and settle into permanence. The extraction operation started with Pratt managing it and 3 men working the initial exposed sections of the quartz vein. The stamping equipment arrived from the east at the end of summer, transported in pieces up the canyon trail on 6 mules, and reassembled on a site Pratt had prepared with the careful foresight of a man who'd done this before and knew where the mistakes were. The SOR went to a processing facility in Copper Vale initially, until the proceeds justified building their own. The settlement grew the way settlements grow when they're built on something real, not quickly and not perfectly, but persistently. Families arrived, assessed what they found, and mostly stayed. Some left because the canyon was not for everyone, and Maren did not try to make it for everyone. She wanted people who wanted to be there, not people who were there because they had nowhere else to go, because she had been the person with nowhere else to go, and she understood the difference between that and choosing. The road was the first major project, a proper road up the canyon from the main trail, wide enough for loaded wagons, graded against the slope in a way that was engineering, rather than just widening what was already there. Gideon supervised it with 2 of the younger men, and it took most of a spring and summer, and when it was finished, one of the things Maren was proudest of, in a way she found slightly embarrassing to admit, because it was a road, not a house or a mining operation. But the road was the thing that made everything else reachable, and she understood roads now in the specific way you understand something you've done without for long enough. Tobin arrived in the early fall of the second year. He came without advance notice, which surprised her, because the Tobin she'd known had not been the kind of person who did things without advance notice. He appeared at the canyon entrance with his tools on his back and his forge equipment on a cart he'd pulled himself for the last 3 miles of trail because the mule he'd hired in the last town had refused the final grade. She saw him from the cabin door and stood there for a moment before walking toward him. He looked older, 2 years older than when she'd last seen him in person, but also differently older than that older, in the way people get older when they've been carrying something heavy. He set the cart down and looked at her and didn't try to arrange his face into anything it wasn't. "I left," he said. "Redstone Crossing 2 weeks ago. I heard the charter situation was getting complicated there." Complicated is one word. He looked around the canyon, the structures, the road, the people moving between them. He looked at the cabin that had started all of this. "You built a town." "We built a town," she said. "I started it." He was quiet for a moment. "I should have stood up," he said. "In the meeting. I've said that before, and it doesn't change what it was." "No," she agreed, "it doesn't." "Can I?" He stopped. Started again. "Is there a place for a blacksmith here?" She looked at him. The honest face that had always been too guileless for the politics of Redstone Crossing. The hands that had pressed an axe into hers, in the dark outside a meeting hall, and then walked away from what he should have done, and then spent 2 years trying to do something instead of nothing. People were not simple. She had learned that at great length in this canyon and in the world beyond it. People were complicated and inconsistent, and they failed when the cost of not failing was too high, and sometimes they came back around to doing the right thing, even though coming back around didn't erase the original failure. Both things could be true at once. Both things were. "There's a place for a blacksmith," she said. "Come and eat something." Redstone Crossing's dissolution was not dramatic. Ephraim Rusk did not leave in disgrace or ruin, which was not the ending that felt right, but was the one that happened. Because life is not primarily organized around what feels right. What happened was slower and less legible than disgrace. Most of its windows were dark. The charter boundary issue, once it was part of the public record, meant that several of Ephraim's land claim decisions from the previous years came under review. He spent money on lawyers. His authority, which had always been the kind that depends on appearing unchallengeable, lost its appearance first, and then, gradually, the substance that the appearance had been maintaining. Calder's theft, the original theft, the thing that had started all of this, was finally put on the record when 2 families who had stayed silent in the meeting hall gave written statements to the territorial administrator as part of the charter review process. Not the dramatic public reckoning that part of Maren had wanted. Just 2 pieces of paper in a bureaucratic file that said what had actually happened. Pell's family, she learned through Tobin, had eventually been cleared of the ration reduction and had left Redstone Crossing the previous winter for a settlement further east. She heard that and felt the particular complicated feeling of a wrong being addressed too late, too undamaged, and too soon to call it justice. And she sat with the feeling for a while without trying to resolve it into something cleaner, because it wasn't clean, and making it clean would have been a kind of dishonesty. Calder himself came to the canyon once in the 3rd year. She didn't know he was coming. He appeared at the canyon entrance in the late afternoon on a horse that was thinner than it should be, and he was thinner than he'd been and carried himself differently, not the deliberate ease of a man who has never been seriously challenged, but the constrained posture of someone who has recently learned what challenge feels like. She was working at the table outside the cabin when he came down the trail, and she watched Tim come and thought about what she was going to do and made the decision before he reached her. She let him speak. He talked for about 5 minutes, which was 2 minutes of working up to something and 3 minutes of saying it. He said that he knew what he'd done. He said that he hadn't been able to say that to his father, that there was something in him that still couldn't, but he could say it to her. He said that what had happened in the meeting hall was wrong, and he'd known it was wrong at the time, and he'd let it happen anyway, and then he'd made it worse. He said he didn't expect anything from saying it. She listened to all of it. She thought about what it cost him to be here, which was not nothing, and she thought about what it would and wouldn't change, which was most things. I believe you, she said. That doesn't fix what happened. I know. Pell's family lost time they don't get back. I spent 2.5 months alone in a canyon because you weren't willing to be honest when honesty would have cost you something. Those facts don't go away because you've said this. I know, he said, again quietly, without argument. She looked at him for a moment. Is there something you need? He seemed surprised by the question. No, I just needed to say it. Then you've said it, she said. I'm not going to tell you I forgive you, because I don't think that's mine to give on behalf of everyone you harmed. But I heard you, she paused. That's what I can offer. He nodded once. He left without staying, which was the right call, and she noted it. Most of its windows were dark. The world was full of people who did damage, and then needed the people they damaged to make them feel better about it. He had not asked her to do that, and she gave him credit for it even as she watched him ride back up the canyon and out of the canyon. She did not see him again after that. She heard years later that he'd settled somewhere north and worked as a laborer and kept to himself. She had no particular feelings about that either way. What she had feelings about was the evening of the third year's autumn, when she stood on the expanded porch of the cabin that had been added to and altered so many times it bore only an architectural relationship to the original structure, and watched the main street of what people were now calling Maren's Reach go about its end-of-day business. The stamping mill's rhythm had quieted for the evening, the regular percussive heartbeat that she'd long since stopped consciously hearing. Children were moving through the streets in the gathering dark, the specific, chaotic energy of children who know the territory and are using it. Gideon was working late in his workshop, the sound of a hand plane moving across wood coming through his open door. Tobin's forge had gone cold for the evening, the way she could tell from the smell, or the absence of it. Sadie Corbin came out of the store building across the road and called something to her youngest son, who reversed direction without breaking stride, which was the particular achievement of a child who has been caught before he's gotten started. Sadie looked across at Maren on the porch and raised a hand, and Maren raised one back. Bramble was in the extended paddock to the right of the original cave entrance, which had been built out properly now with proper fencing and a shelter that was considerably more comfortable than anything Maren had slept in for her first 3 months in the canyon. He was older than he'd been, and showing it in the white that had spread around his muzzle and the particular careful way he moved in the morning before he'd warmed up. He was fine. He was, as far as mules went, deeply and contentedly fine. She had been thinking, standing there, about the person who had walked out of Redstone Crossing 3 years ago with 30 pounds of provisions and 1 axe, and a decision that was made somewhere in the chest, below the level of the rational mind, place something fundamental either holds or breaks. She had been 19 and furious and alone and certain in the moments when certainty was hardest to maintain that she would not let such a certainty break, keep even when everything else did. She thought about the things she had not been in that canyon in those first months. She had not been graceful about it. She had lost her temper at a mule and said unkind things. She had cried on a provision crate when no one was looking. She had lain awake, cataloging the unfairness of her situation with obsessive thoroughness and resisted the urge to stop because the cataloging felt like the only power she had. She had built a roof wrong and had to tear it down and do it again. And she had been genuinely, inarticulately furious about that, standing in the ruin of her own miscalculation. None of that made her extraordinary. She knew that. She was not a person who believed in her own extraordinariness. She was a person who had made a decision in the worst moment of her life and then made it again the next morning, and then every morning after that for as long as it took. That was the thing nobody told you about survival. She had come to understand. Not the canyon kind, but the other kind. The kind that involved getting through what people said you wouldn't get through, and building what people said you couldn't build, and standing in the space you'd made for yourself without asking permission to be there. Nobody told you it was going to require making the same decision over and over, in the small ordinary moments when nobody was watching and there was no dramatic resolution on offer, just the next hour of work and the next problem and the next morning. The decision was not made once. It was made continuously, in the accumulated weight of all the ordinary mornings. She leaned against the porch post that Gideon had put in, solid and true and level, the kind of post that would be there long after she was gone, and she watched her town settle into its evening and felt the specific, unspectacular satisfaction of someone who had made something real. They had sent her away because she took up too much space. She had used that space to build somewhere else entirely, somewhere that's had room for people who needed it, that ran on work and fairness and the understanding that no single person's judgment was sufficient to determine the worth of another human being. It was not perfect. She was not perfect. The settlement had problems she was working on, and people she disagreed with, and decisions she'd made that she was still second-guessing. But it was hers, and it was real, and it was built from the place she'd been thrown away to, and that fact continued to mean something she had no clean word for. Something bigger than satisfaction and smaller than peace, the specific feeling of a life that has been lived in the direction of what you actually believed rather than what was convenient or safe or what the world told you to expect of you. Bramble lifted his head from the water trough and looked at her across the paddock with his long, skeptical face. She looked back at him. "I know," she said. "We did all right." He went back to his water, which was for Bramble as close to agreement as it got.